Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I still haven't told many people about what happened that December in 1984. My friends and I were on winter break from the University of Winnipeg, and we'd decided to treat ourselves to a ski trip at Lake Louise. At 21, I was in my third year studying forestry, which I guess made me more observant of the natural world than most. My roommates Jen, Mike, and Keith had convinced two other friends, Dave and Sarah, to join us. We'd pooled our money to rent a small chalet for 4 days, December 18th through the 21st. The first 2 days were exactly what we wanted. Clear skies, decent snow, and that perfect winter chill that makes coming back to a warm fireplace feel like heaven. We'd ski during the day, cook dinner together, and stay up playing cards and drinking hot chocolate, well, sometimes with a splash of something stronger. It was on December 20th that everything changed. We'd had a good day of skiing, nothing spectacular, just enjoying ourselves. Around 4 in the afternoon, we decided to drive into town to grab some groceries and maybe check out a local pub for dinner instead of cooking. The sun was starting to set as we drove back toward our chalet around 5:30. That time of day in December in Alberta, the light gets strange. Not quite dark yet, but everything takes on this bluish-grey quality that makes distances hard to judge. We were in Mike's old Chevy Suburban, all 6 of us crammed in with our groceries. I was in the middle row with Jen and Sarah, while Keith rode shotgun and Dave sat in the back with the food. We'd taken a slightly different route back to the chalet, a road that wound around the base of one of the mountains. I remember we were talking about what to make for breakfast the next morning, when Keith suddenly shouted, "Holy shit, look at that!" Mike slowed the car down immediately. "What? Where?" Keith was pointing out his window toward the mountain slope. "There, about halfway up. Do you see it?" At first, I couldn't make out what he was pointing at. The mountain face was steep and partially covered in snow with exposed rock and some scattered evergreens. Then I saw movement against the snow. "I see it," I said. "What is that?" Mike pulled over to the side of the road. We all fell silent as we stared at the mountainside. The thing was dark brown or maybe black, and it was climbing up the mountain. Not scrambling on all fours like you'd expect from a person in that terrain, but walking upright, steadily ascending the steep slope with a confident stride that seemed impossible on that incline. "That can't be a person," Dave said from the back. "No way." "Is it a bear?" Jen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I'd grown up in rural Manitoba. I'd seen bears before, black bears, even a few grizzlies at a distance during family trips to national parks. "That's not a bear," I said firmly. "Bears don't move like that." We sat there, the engine idling, for what must have been 5 or 10 minutes, just watching this thing climb. No one reached for a camera. We were all just frozen, watching. I wish now we'd thought to take pictures, but in 1984, none of us carried cameras everywhere like people do today. The creature was moving with purpose, never breaking stride, never dropping to all fours, even on what looked like nearly vertical sections. It used its arms for balance occasionally, but it remained bizarrely upright the whole time. "How big do you think it is?" Sarah asked. Mike squinted through the windshield. "It's hard to tell from here, but big. Really big." 8 feet at least, Keith said. "Maybe 9. That sounded right to me. The proportions were all wrong for a human. Too broad, too powerful looking. Its arms seemed longer than they should be, swinging slightly as it moved. "We should follow it," Dave suggested. "How?" Mike asked. "You want to climb up there? It's getting dark, and that thing is moving like it knows exactly where it's going." He was right. The light was fading fast now, and the creature was becoming harder to see against the darker parts of the mountain. Within another minute or two, It disappeared into what might have been a tree line, or perhaps just the growing shadows. We sat in silence for a long moment after it vanished. I realized I'd been holding my breath. "What the hell did we just see?" Sarah finally asked. No one answered at first. Then Keith said what I think we were all thinking. "That looked like Bigfoot." Mike laughed nervously. "Come on, man, there's no such thing." "Then what was it?" I challenged him. "It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person. What walks upright like that, especially on a mountainside?" "Maybe it was some crazy rock climber in dark clothing," Jen suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. "No way," Dave said. "Did you see how fast it was moving? And no climber would be that big." "We should report this," Keith said, "to, I don't know, park rangers or something." We debated this as Mike put the car back in drive and continued toward our chalet. I think we all felt a bit shaken up. The encounter had lasted maybe 10 minutes total, but it had completely disrupted our sense of reality. "They'll think we're crazy," Sarah said, "or that we've been drinking." "We haven't been, though," I pointed out. "Not a drop all day." That was true. We'd planned to have beers with dinner, but none of us had been drinking yet. We were completely sober when we saw whatever that was on the mountain. By the time we reached the chalet, it was fully dark. We brought in the groceries and tried to act normal, but the conversation kept circling back to what we'd seen. Mike made pasta for dinner, but I barely remember eating it. My mind was replaying the sighting over and over. "The way it moved," I said at one point. "It wasn't struggling at all. It was like the mountain wasn't even a challenge." "Did you notice it never slipped?" Keith added. "Not once on a snowy mountainside. That's not normal." We were sitting around the small dining table in our chalet, voices low despite the fact that we were alone. Or at least, we thought we were alone. "Excuse me?" We all jumped. Standing in the doorway between the dining area and the small lobby of the chalet building was an older man, maybe in his 50s, with a weathered face and a grey beard. He was wearing flannel and jeans, looking exactly like the kind of guy who'd spend all his time in the mountains. "Sorry to intrude," he said, but I couldn't help overhearing. "You folks saw something on the mountain today?" We all exchanged glances. Mike spoke first. "Yeah, we did. Something unusual." The man nodded, unsurprised. "Tall, dark-colored, moving upright?" My stomach did a flip. "You've seen it too?" He pulled up a chair from a nearby table without asking and sat down with us. "I was hiking up in that same area back in August. Found some tracks in the mud after a rainfall. 17 inches long they were. Got pictures of them somewhere." 17 inches? Dave exclaimed. "That's huge." "What do you think it is?" Sarah asked the man. He shrugged. "Locals don't talk about it much, but things are seen up in these mountains from time to time. Been that way for generations. First Nations people have stories going back centuries." "A Sasquatch?" Keith asked directly. The man didn't flinch at the word. "I can't say for sure, but I know what I saw, and I know what it wasn't. Wasn't a bear, wasn't a moose, wasn't a person." That's exactly what we were saying. I leaned forward, feeling validated. It was climbing that mountain like it was nothing, and it never went on all fours. Not even once. "Where exactly did you see it?" the man asked. We described the location as best we could. The man nodded thoughtfully. "There are caves up in that area, old mining tunnels too, some of them, places where something could live without being detected." We peppered him with questions for nearly an hour. Had he reported his tracks? Yes, to a researcher he knew. Had others seen similar things? Yes, though most kept quiet about it. Did he think there was more than one? Possibly. Finally, the man stood up to leave. "I'm heading out early tomorrow, but I wanted you folks to know you're not crazy. Whatever's up in those mountains, it's been there a long time." "Wait," I said. "We don't even know your name. And do you have those photos of the tracks you could show us?" "Name's Bill," he said. And the photos are back home in Calgary. If you're really interested, there's a researcher named Guy Phillips who collects these stories. You might want to talk to him. After Bill left, we stayed up late into the night discussing everything. Part of me was afraid to go to bed, afraid I'd dream about that thing on the mountain, moving with its impossible steady gait up inclines that would challenge professional climbers. The next day was our last at Lake Louise. We debated trying to find the spot where we'd seen the creature, maybe look for tracks, but a heavy snow had fallen overnight, covering everything in a fresh blanket of white. Besides, none of us was equipped for serious mountain hiking, especially in winter conditions. We spent our final day skiing as planned, but my heart wasn't in it. My eyes kept straying to the mountains around us, scanning the slopes and tree lines for any sign of movement. I kept thinking about what Bill had said about caves and old tunnels. Was something watching us from up there right now? When I got back to Winnipeg after the break, I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd seen. I went to the library and looked up everything I could find about Sasquatch sightings in Alberta. There wasn't much in the public record, but I found enough to convince me that our experience wasn't unique. In August 1985, I got a call from Jen. She said she'd been contacted by that researcher Bill had mentioned, Guy Phillips. Apparently, he'd heard about our sighting and wanted to interview us. I agreed immediately, eager to talk to someone who wouldn't dismiss what we'd seen. The interview with Phillips was thorough. He asked detailed questions about the creature's height, proportions, movement and behavior. He showed us photos of known hoaxes and asked if what we saw resembled any of them. It didn't. He showed us pictures of bears walking upright and asked if that's what we could have seen. Again, no, the proportions and movement were all wrong. When he asked how far away we thought the creature was, I estimated 1 to 2 blocks. Close enough to see clearly, especially with the contrast of the dark figure against patches of snow, but not close enough to make out facial features or fine details. The researcher seemed particularly interested in the creature's ability to climb while remaining bipedal. He told us that matched other reports from mountainous regions, where these beings apparently navigate difficult terrain with surprising ease. It's been almost 40 years since that December afternoon, and I've never seen anything like it again. I've gone hiking and camping hundreds of times since then, all over North America, always with one eye on the tree line, always listening for unusual sounds. Nothing. Sometimes I wonder if we really saw what we think we saw. Memory plays tricks, especially after so much time. But then I remember the absolute silence in that car as 6 college students watched something impossible moving up that mountain. I remember the goosebumps on my arms that had nothing to do with the winter cold. I've tried to find Bill over the years, the man from the chalet who claimed to have photographed those 17-inch tracks. I've never been able to track him down. Sometimes I wonder if he was real or if we somehow collectively imagined him too. A convenient validation of our experience. Mike and Keith still refuse to hike in remote areas. Dave became obsessed for a while, joining Bigfoot research groups and going on expeditions before eventually getting married and moving on with his life. Sarah never talks about it. Jen and I catch up occasionally, and sometimes we'll cautiously bring up that thing at Lake Louise, testing to see if the other still believes. I do still believe, not because I want to, but because I can't explain what we saw any other way. I've looked at all the rational explanations. Bears with mange that walk upright, hoaxers in suits, misidentified humans at a distance. None of them fit what we observed. The size, the fluid movement, the sheer ease with which it navigated that steep slope without ever dropping to all fours. Every winter, when the first snow falls, I find myself thinking about Lake Louise. I imagine that creature still up there, moving through the mountains, perhaps watching headlights on the roads below, staying just out of sight, climbing with that same powerful, steady stride that defied everything I thought I knew about what lives in our forests. Whatever we saw that day, it's still out there. And sometimes, especially on snowy evenings, when the light fades to that same bluish grey, it was that December afternoon, I can almost feel it watching me, even here in my suburban home, hundreds of miles away from those Alberta mountains. Story 2. I still get a chill down my spine every time I drive over that bridge on Highway 1A. It's been 40 years, but I remember it like it was yesterday. My wife Julia doesn't like me talking about it, says it brings back too many bad memories of the stress it caused during her pregnancy. But I need to get this off my chest, once and for all. It was May 12th, 1983. Julia was 5 months pregnant with our first child. We were driving back from Canmore after visiting her parents. It was getting late, around 7:30 p.m. But in Alberta in May, the sun doesn't set until after 9, so there was plenty of daylight left. The weather was clear, unusually warm for that time of year. We were taking Highway 1A, where it crosses Old Fork Creek on the Stony Indian Reserve. It's a beautiful stretch of road that winds through the foothills of the Rockies, trees on both sides, mountains in the distance, the kind of scenery that makes you glad to live in Alberta. I was doing about 80 km/h, just cruising along. Julia was fiddling with the radio, trying to find something other than static. Our '79 Ford pickup had a decent engine, but a terrible radio. We were crossing the bridge over Old Fork Creek when Julia suddenly gasped and grabbed my arm. "Dan, look out!" I slammed on the brakes instinctively. The truck skidded a bit, and that's when I saw it. Standing right in the middle of the road, maybe 30 feet ahead of us, was something. My first thought was bear, but that lasted only a split second. Bears don't stand upright like that. This thing was standing on 2 legs, perfectly balanced, like a human. But it wasn't human, not even close. It was massive. I'm 6'2", and this thing towered over me. Had to be at least 7, maybe 8 feet tall. Covered in dark brown hair, not fur like a bear, but hair, like a human's, but longer and coarser. The sun was behind us, illuminating it perfectly. The hair had a slight reddish tint where the sunlight hit it, but its face, that's what I'll never forget. The hair was thinner there, revealing black skin underneath. It had deep-set eyes under a heavy, protruding brow ridge. They were dark, I couldn't make out a color, but they were intelligent. That's what struck me. Those weren't animal eyes. There was something looking back at us. Time seemed to slow down. The truck was still rolling to a stop when it turned its head to look directly at us. Its movement was smooth, deliberate, not jerky or animal-like. It had a broad, flat nose and a wide mouth, no snout like a bear. The proportions were all wrong for any animal I knew, and I've been hunting in these woods my whole life. Then it moved. Jesus, the speed of it. One moment it was standing there, the next it was crossing the road in 3 or 4 massive strides. Its arms were enormous, longer than a human's should be, and muscular. They swung slightly as it moved, but not like a gorilla's. More controlled. It reached the side of the road where there was a fence, one of those simple 4-foot wire fences marking the boundary of a property. Without breaking stride, it cleared that fence like it was stepping over a twig. No hesitation, no gathering itself to jump, just a fluid motion, and it was over. The whole encounter couldn't have lasted more than 6 or 7 seconds, but I remember every detail. The truck finally came to a complete stop, and I immediately threw it into park. My hunter instincts kicked in. I wanted to follow it, to see where it went, to confirm what we'd just seen. "I'm going after it," I said, already reaching for the door handle. Julia's grip on my arm tightened. "No, Dan, please," she pleaded. Her voice was trembling. "Think about the baby. Think about me. What if it comes back?" I looked over at her. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She had both hands on her belly now, like she was protecting our unborn child. That snapped me out of it. Okay, I said, trying to sound calmer than I felt. "We'll keep going." I put the truck back in drive and started moving again, but slowly. As we passed the spot where it had jumped the fence, we could see the trees and underbrush moving about 20 yards in, like something large was pushing through. Small trees were swaying, branches breaking. Whatever that thing was, it was moving fast. "Did you see that?" I asked Julia, my voice barely above a whisper, like it might hear us. "What was it?" she asked, still clutching her belly. "A bear." "That was no bear," I said. "Bears don't walk like that. Bears don't jump fences like that." "Then what?" she asked, but I think she already knew. We both did. "Sasquatch," I said, the word feeling strange in my mouth. Growing up in Alberta, we'd all heard the stories. The Stony people had legends about them going back centuries. Tourists sometimes claimed sightings, but I'd always written it off as nonsense. Tall tales or misidentifications of bears. "That's impossible," Julia said, but there was no conviction in her voice. She'd seen it too. "You saw it," I said. "That was no man in a suit. No bear. No moose. Nothing I've ever seen before." We drove in silence for a few minutes, both of us processing what had just happened. I couldn't stop replaying it in my head. The way it moved, so fast yet so controlled. The intelligence in those eyes, the sheer size of it. "We need to tell someone," I finally said. "Who?" "The police. They'll think we're crazy," Julia replied. She was right. Who would believe us? But I knew what I saw. "There are researchers who study this sort of thing. We could find one of them," I suggested. "Not now, Dan. Please, I just want to go home. I don't feel well." Julia was looking even paler now, and I noticed her hands trembling. I reached over and took her hand. "Okay, we'll go home. But I want to come back tomorrow, in daylight, look for tracks." "No," she said firmly. "Promise me you won't come back here alone." I hesitated. The hunter in me was desperate to go back, to find proof of what we'd seen. But the look on Julia's face, the fear in her eyes, made me reconsider. "Okay," I said, "I promise." The rest of the drive home was tense. We lived about an hour away from the spot, in a small house on the outskirts of Calgary. By the time we got home, it was getting dark. Julia went straight to bed, claiming a headache, but I couldn't sleep. I sat up half the night with a beer, replaying the sighting over and over in my mind. The next morning, Julia seemed determined to pretend nothing had happened. She made breakfast as usual, talked about her plans for the nursery, avoided any mention of our encounter on the highway, but I couldn't let it go. "We need to tell someone," I said again over coffee. She sighed. "Who?" "I don't know, but this is important. People need to know these things exist." "Dan, please, I just want to forget about it. I haven't slept all night. I keep seeing that thing in my dreams, thinking about what could have happened if we'd stopped." I could see the stress was wearing on her, and I worried about the baby, but I also knew I couldn't just let this go. "What if I find someone discreet, someone who studies these things scientifically?" She thought about it for a minute. "Fine. But I don't want our names out there. I don't want to be those crazy people who claim they saw Bigfoot." "Fair enough," I agreed. It took some digging, but I eventually found a researcher named Thomas Steenberg who had published work on Sasquatch sightings in Western Canada. I called him, and he seemed genuinely interested in our encounter. He agreed to meet us at a coffee shop in Calgary the following weekend. Meeting with Steenberg was a relief. He didn't treat us like we were crazy. He asked detailed, specific questions about what we'd seen, the creature's height, proportions, gait, coloration. He showed us photos and drawings of other reported Sasquatch, asking if any resembled what we'd seen. "Your description matches several other reliable sightings in the area," he told us. "The Stony Indian Reserve has a long history of these encounters. The location makes sense. It's a perfect corridor for a large animal to move between wilderness areas while staying hidden most of the time." "So you believe us?" Julia asked, sounding relieved. "I do," Steenberg said. "And I'd like to include your sighting in my research. With your permission, of course." At first, we agreed. It felt good to be taken seriously, to have our experience validated. But as the weeks went by, things changed. Julia started getting phone calls from people who'd heard about our sighting, other researchers, local news, even some conspiracy theory types. Steenberg had been discreet, but word gets around in those circles. The stress was taking a toll on Julia and the pregnancy. She started having nightmares, elevated blood pressure at her checkups. Her doctor was concerned. "This needs to stop," she told me one night after another call from someone wanting details about our Bigfoot encounter. "I'll call Steenberg, tell him to remove our names from everything," I promised. And I did. Steenberg was understanding. He agreed to anonymize our account in his research, referring to us only as a couple or by first names only. But the damage was done. Julia couldn't shake the fear and stress. Every time she heard a noise outside at night, she'd freeze. She stopped wanting to go on drives in the country. A couple of times, I caught her just staring out the window, like she was looking for something. Our son was born in September. Healthy, thankfully, despite all the stress. We named him Michael. Having him to focus on helped Julia move past the encounter, at least on the surface. But sometimes, when she thought I wasn't looking, I'd catch that same fearful expression on her face. For my part, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I wanted to go back, to look for evidence, maybe set up a camera. But I'd promised Julia I wouldn't, and I kept that promise. Instead, I started researching, reading every book and article I could find about Sasquatch sightings, especially in Alberta. The more I read, the more convinced I became that what we'd seen was real. The details from other sightings matched ours too closely to be coincidence. The height, the proportions, the way it moved, the intelligence in its eyes. These weren't just stories, these were experiences like ours. Over time, life moved on. Michael grew. We had another child, a daughter. I built a career in construction, but I never forgot what we saw that day on Highway 1A. Julia and I made a pact not to discuss it with anyone else. Not our kids, not our friends. It became this thing between us, this secret shared experience that we both knew changed how we saw the world, but that we couldn't talk about without risking being labeled as crazy. Years passed, decades. Our children grew up and had kids of their own. Julia and I retired, but every so often something would trigger the memory. A documentary on TV, a news story about a sighting driving past that stretch of highway. Last year, I finally broke our silence. Our grandson, Ethan, was staying with us for the weekend. He's 12, smart as a whip, interested in the outdoors like I was at his age. We were sitting on the porch, and he was telling me about a cryptozoology podcast he'd been listening to. "Grandpa, do you think Bigfoot is real?" he asked. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I looked at Julia, sitting in her chair, knitting. She met my eyes and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. So I told him everything. The drive, the creature on the road, the way it looked at us, how it jumped the fence, the fear, the wonder, the way it changed us. When I finished, Ethan was wide-eyed. "Do you think it's still out there?" he asked. I nodded. "I do. That part of Alberta hasn't changed much in 40 years. Still lots of wilderness for something like that to hide in. I want to go look for it," he said, with all the enthusiasm of a 12-year-old. Julia spoke up then. "That's not a good idea, Ethan. Some mysteries are better left alone." "But I'm not so sure. Not anymore. I'm 71 years old now. I don't have many years left, and I've spent 40 of them wondering about what we saw that day. I've been thinking about breaking my promise to Julia, about going back there one last time. Maybe take Ethan with me, set up some cameras, see if I can finally get proof of what we saw. Because the thing that's haunted me all these years isn't fear. It's not the creature's size or speed or the alienness of it. It's those eyes, those intelligent, knowing eyes that looked right at us, eyes that understood exactly what we were. What haunts me is the question, If it could recognize us, understand what we were, then what else did it know? What else is out there in those woods that we've convinced ourselves doesn't exist? I need to know before it's too late. Even now, 40 years later, I can close my eyes and see it perfectly. Stepping onto that road, turning to look at us, clearing that fence like it was nothing, real, undeniable, life-changing, and somewhere out there I believe it's still watching, waiting, knowing. Story 3. I've never been one to believe in monsters. Growing up in Falk, Arkansas, I heard all the stories about strange creatures in the woods, but I always brushed them off as tall tales meant to keep kids from wandering too far from home. But what happened that night in May of '71, I can't explain it. I've tried for years to make sense of it, to convince myself it was just some twisted prank or a bear or something normal. But I know what I saw. I know what happened to us. My husband Bobby and I had just moved into our new place near Jonesville. It wasn't much, but it was ours. A small house on the edge of the woods, peaceful and quiet. Bobby's brother Douglas was staying with us for a few days to help with some repairs around the place. We were excited about starting our life together there, even though some locals had given us strange looks when we mentioned where we'd bought the property. "Just be careful out there after dark," an old man at the general store had told me. I remember laughing it off at the time. May first started like any other day. Bobby and Douglas had spent most of it working on fixing the porch steps while I cleaned inside and unpacked our belongings. The house needed work, but we were young and ambitious. By evening, we were all exhausted. The men sat at the kitchen table playing cards while I decided to lie down on the couch in the living room. I hadn't planned on falling asleep there, but the next thing I knew, it was the middle of the night. I'm not sure what woke me at first. Maybe it was the odd silence. The crickets had stopped chirping, and the usual night sounds had disappeared. Or maybe it was that feeling of being watched that pulled me from sleep. But as I opened my eyes and adjusted to the darkness, I realized something was terribly wrong. There, at the window just a few feet from where I lay, was a face. Not a human face. The eyes reflected the moonlight with an unnatural reddish glow, like nothing I'd ever seen before. It was staring directly at me, and I felt my entire body go cold with fear. But what made me scream, the thing that still gives me nightmares to this day, was the hand. This massive, hairy hand with long, curved claws had pushed through a tear in our window screen and was reaching inside. The fingers were stretching, grasping at the air just inches from where I'd been sleeping. I screamed louder than I've ever screamed in my life. I couldn't move. I was frozen there on the couch, my eyes locked with this thing at our window. All I could do was scream. Bobby and Douglas came running in from the kitchen, Bobby still holding his cards. "What's wrong? What happened?" he yelled, rushing to my side. I couldn't speak. I just pointed at the window. But by then, whatever it was had pulled its hand back and moved away. There was something at the window, I finally managed to say, my voice shaking so badly I could barely form words. It had red eyes, Bobby, and its hand, oh God, its hand was inside. Douglas grabbed his rifle from where he'd left it by the door. Bobby took the shotgun from above the fireplace. "Stay inside and lock the door behind us," Bobby told me before they headed out onto the porch. I wanted to beg them not to go, but I was still too terrified to think straight. I did as Bobby said, locking the door and then huddled in the corner of the room, as far from the windows as I could get. I could hear them outside, moving around the house, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. Then I heard Douglas shout, "Over there! In the trees!" A gunshot rang out, so loud it made me jump and cover my ears. Then another, the sound of the men running, branches breaking. Through the thin walls of our house, I could hear Bobby yelling something to Douglas, but I couldn't make out the words. After what seemed like forever, they came back inside, both breathing hard and looking pale as ghosts. "We saw it," Bobby said, his voice unsteady. In the woods, it was standing upright like a man, but Jesus, it wasn't a man. Douglas nodded, his knuckles white where he gripped his rifle. It was covered in hair, dark hair, and big, at least 6 feet tall, but built like nothing I've ever seen. I shot at it, but it moved so fast. "We need to call Constable Walraven," I said, already moving toward the phone. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial. Ernest Walraven had been the constable in Falk for as long as I could remember. When he answered, groggy with sleep, I tried to explain what had happened without sounding completely hysterical. To his credit, he didn't dismiss us. He said he'd be right over. While we waited, the 3 of us sat in the kitchen. None of us wanted to be near the windows. None of us wanted to be alone. Bobby kept the shotgun across his knees, his eyes constantly moving to the doors and windows. "I've heard stories," Douglas said quietly, "about things in these woods, strange creatures, people seeing something like a giant hairy man." "That's just nonsense to scare kids," Bobby said, but there was no conviction in his voice. When Constable Walraven arrived, he took our statements and then went outside with a flashlight to look around. He was out there for about 20 minutes before he came back in. "Found some tracks," he said, removing his hat and running a hand through his thinning hair. "Nothing like I've ever seen before. Too big for a bear and shaped all wrong. And there's scratch marks on the side of your house under that window." He didn't say more than that, but the look on his face told me he believed us. That scared me more than if he'd dismissed the whole thing. Walraven said he'd come back in the morning with some other officers to look more thoroughly, but he didn't think we should stay alone. Douglas assured him he was staying with us and had his rifle. The constable nodded, told us to keep the doors locked, and left. We tried to settle in after that. None of us wanted to sleep, but we were exhausted. Bobby suggested we all stay in the living room, away from the bedrooms with their more isolated windows. Douglas took the recliner. Bobby settled onto the couch, and I made a pallet on the floor beside the couch, close to my husband. I don't think any of us really slept. Every little noise had us on edge. Around 3 in the morning, we heard it. Something was moving around outside the house. Heavy footsteps circling, stopping occasionally. Then it came to the front door and started kicking at it. Not knocking, kicking, hard enough to make the whole door rattle in its frame. Douglas was on his feet in an instant, rifle raised. Bobby grabbed the shotgun and positioned himself between me and the door. The kicking continued, getting more violent, like whatever was out there was enraged. "Get back!" Bobby shouted toward the door. Then he fired a shot through the door itself. There was a sound, not quite human, not quite animal, a kind of roar that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Then the kicking stopped, and we heard something heavy moving away from the house fast. None of us moved for several minutes. My ears were ringing from the gunshot in the enclosed space. Finally, Bobby went to the door and pressed his ear against it. "I think it's gone," he whispered. We stayed huddled together in the living room as the hours crawled by. Dawn came, bringing with it a false sense of security. With the first light, Bobby decided to go out and check around the house. Both Douglas and I tried to talk him out of it. "The sun's up," he said, trying to sound confident. "Whatever it was is probably long gone by now. I'll just take a quick look around and come right back in." I begged him not to go, but he was determined. He took the shotgun and went out alone while Douglas stayed with me, his rifle ready. I'll never forget the moment we heard Bobby scream. It wasn't a shout or a yell. It was a scream of pure terror. Douglas bolted for the door, and I was right behind him. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. Bobby was on the ground about 20 yards from the house near the edge of the trees. Something massive was on top of him, a huge hair-covered body. It had him by the shoulders, dragging him toward the woods. Bobby was fighting, kicking and punching, but it was like watching someone fight against a force of nature. Douglas raised his rifle and fired. The creature reared up, and God, it was tall, so much bigger than it had seemed through the window. For a split second, it turned toward us, and I saw those eyes again, burning red in a face that was almost but not quite human. Then it released Bobby and ran into the trees, moving inhumanly fast for something so large. We rushed to Bobby. His shirt was torn to shreds, and there were deep scratches across his chest and arms. He was conscious but in shock, babbling about the strength of the thing, how it had grabbed him from behind as he was looking at some strange footprints. We got him into our truck and drove straight to the hospital in town. The doctor who treated him kept asking what kind of animal had attacked him. We didn't know what to say. How do you explain something that shouldn't exist? While Bobby was being treated, Sheriff's Department officers went out to our property. When they came to the hospital later, they confirmed finding numerous large, human-like footprints all around our house and deep into the woods. One officer pulled me aside and asked in a low voice if what we'd seen looked anything like the Boggy Creek monster that people had been reporting in the area since the 50s. I didn't know what to say. I'd heard those stories growing up, but never put any stock in them. Now, I wasn't sure what to believe. We didn't go back to that house. We couldn't. We stayed with my parents in town while Bobby recovered, and then we sold the property for whatever we could get. We moved to Little Rock, where Bobby found work at a garage. Douglas went back to Oklahoma. Over the years, I've seen news reports about Bigfoot sightings and always felt a chill. I've heard that the creature around Falk was usually described as shy, not aggressive like what attacked us. That makes me wonder sometimes if what came to our window that night was something altogether different, something worse. I still can't help but look at the windows when I'm home alone at night. I still have nightmares about that hairy hand reaching through the screen. And I still wonder why it singled us out, why it came back again and again. Bobby doesn't like to talk about it. The physical scars have healed, but he still wakes up sometimes in a cold sweat. Douglas called once, years later, to tell us he'd seen a documentary about the legend of Boggy Creek and had to turn it off halfway through. I've never gone back to Falk. I hear they've embraced the legend now, selling t-shirts, holding contests for kids to draw the monster. It makes me sick to think about it. They don't know. They didn't see those eyes, didn't feel the malice coming from that creature. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there in those woods, watching through windows at night, waiting for someone else to move into that house. And sometimes, on very dark nights, I swear I can hear something moving outside, circling, looking for a way in. Story 4. I've never told this story to anyone outside my family and the investigators who came afterward. Even now, typing this out makes my hands shake a little. It's been over 50 years, but some memories don't fade with time. My name's Richard Brown. Back in June of 1971, I was teaching music at the local high school near the Dells, Oregon. My wife Emily and I had moved into the Pinewood Mobile Manor Trailer Court about 8 months earlier. It was a decent place, not fancy but affordable for a teacher's salary, and the surrounding area was beautiful. Pine forests, meadows and rocky cliffs made it feel like we were living on the edge of wilderness, even though civilization wasn't far away. I'd always been an outdoorsman, started hunting with my father when I was 12, and I knew the woods around the Dells better than my own classroom. I could identify any animal track, bird call, or tree species in the region. I'm saying this so you understand that when I tell you what happened, it's coming from someone who knows the difference between a bear and, well, something else entirely. The first I heard of anything unusual was on June 2nd. The day before, the owners of the trailer court, Dick Ball, Jim Forkin and Frank Verlander, had apparently seen something while having a meeting in the office. They were looking out the window toward the meadow that borders the property with the cliff face beyond it, when they spotted what they described as a tall, dark grey figure moving through some oak trees about 260 yards away. I didn't pay much attention to their story at first. People see things all the time in the woods, especially at dusk when shadows play tricks on your eyes. But these weren't excitable teenagers or tourists. These were level-headed businessmen who'd lived in the area their whole lives. That evening, Emily and I were coming back from choir practice at the church. It was around 9:30, still light enough to see clearly since it was early June. We just parked our car and were walking toward our trailer when I noticed something standing in the field between the trailer court and the tree line. At first, I thought it might be a bear standing on its hind legs. We'd had a few black bears in the area that spring, digging through trash cans. But this was different. Even from a distance, I could tell it was too tall, too upright. "Emily," I said quietly, "go inside and lock the door." She saw it too and didn't argue. I waited until she was safely inside, then went in and grabbed my Winchester 30-06. It had an 8-power scope mounted on it, which I used for deer hunting in the fall. I didn't intend to shoot whatever was out there necessarily, but I wanted to get a better look. I walked to the edge of our little yard and raised the rifle, not pointing it directly at the figure, but using the scope to observe. What I saw through that lens has stayed with me for 50 years. It was approximately 50 yards away, standing partially obscured by tall grass near where the meadow meets the forest. Through the scope, I could see it clearly. This wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I'd ever encountered in all my years in the woods. The creature stood at least 10 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a massive chest. Its body was covered in dark, grayish-brown hair, about 3 to 4 inches long. The hair wasn't matted or tangled like you'd see on a bear that hasn't shed its winter coat. It was uniform, almost like a short-haired dog, but thicker. Its arms hung down almost to its knees, ending in hands that looked disturbingly human-like, only much larger. The face is what struck me most. It had a pronounced brow ridge, a wide, flat nose, and a mouth that seemed almost too small for its massive head. Its eyes were deep set under that brow, dark and aware. That's the only way I can describe it. This wasn't an animal operating on instinct. There was intelligence there. For about 5 minutes, I observed it through the scope while it stood there, occasionally turning its head to scan the area. It seemed to be listening, maybe even smelling the air. I estimated its weight at between 600 and 800 pounds, based on my experience with large game. The musculature was visible even under the hair. This was an incredibly powerful being. I had a clear shot. My finger actually moved to the trigger, and I began to apply pressure. I'd hunted all my life. Taking the shot should have been automatic, but something stopped me. Looking at this creature through my scope, I couldn't pull the trigger. It seemed more human than animal. The way it stood, the way it moved its head and arms. There was something so familiar about its gestures that pulling the trigger felt wrong, like I'd be committing murder rather than hunting. Suddenly, it turned its head directly toward me. I don't know if it heard something or smelled me, but in that moment, our eyes met through the scope. A chill ran down my spine, unlike anything I've ever felt. It wasn't fear exactly, more like recognition. Like two intelligent species acknowledging each other's existence. Then it simply turned and walked into the forest. Not running in fear, not lumbering like a bear, walking upright like a man with a smooth, powerful stride that covered ground quickly despite its apparent casualness. Within seconds, it had disappeared among the trees. I lowered my rifle, my hands shaking. I stayed there for maybe 10 more minutes, watching the tree line, but it didn't reappear. When I went back inside, Emily was waiting anxiously. "What was it?" she asked. "I don't know," I answered honestly, "but it wasn't a bear." That night I barely slept. I kept replaying those few minutes in my mind, questioning what I'd seen. I'd heard the old stories about Bigfoot or Sasquatch that circulated in the Pacific Northwest, But like most locals, I'd always considered them to be campfire tales or misidentifications of bears. Now I wasn't so sure. The next morning I mentioned what I'd seen to Joe Medarios, the maintenance worker at the trailer court. I expected skepticism, maybe even laughter, but instead Joe looked serious. "The owners saw something similar 2 days ago," he said, "out by the same meadow." "I know," I replied. "I thought they were exaggerating." Joe shook his head. "Dick Ball doesn't exaggerate about anything. Man counts every nail he uses in repairs." Later that day, word got around the trailer park about what I'd seen. Dick Ball came to talk to me himself, asking for details. He said their sighting had only lasted about 20 seconds before the creature moved out of view, but my description matched what they'd observed. Tall, grayish, moving with an eerily human gait. 2 days later, Joe Medarios saw it himself while fixing a water line near the edge of the property. According to him, it was standing just inside the tree line, watching him work. When he looked up and saw it, it didn't run away immediately. It observed him for nearly a minute before backing slowly into the deeper forest. Joe saw it once more about a week later, this time at dusk, crossing the meadow, heading toward the cliff face where there were several caves and rock formations that could provide shelter. By mid-June, word had spread beyond our little community. A couple of investigators from some research group based in Seattle came down to interview everyone who had seen the creature. They seemed particularly interested in my account since I'd had the closest and clearest view through my rifle scope. One of the investigators asked me, "As an experienced hunter, in your professional opinion, what did you see?" I thought carefully before answering. "In my professional opinion, I saw a bipedal primate that doesn't appear in any wildlife manual I've ever read. It moved with purpose and awareness. It noticed me observing it, and it made a conscious decision to leave rather than confront me." "Why didn't you shoot?" the other investigator asked. I remember my exact words. "It seemed more human than animal. Shooting it would have felt like killing a person, not hunting game." They nodded like they'd heard similar statements before. After the initial excitement, things quieted down. There were no more sightings at Pinewood Manor that summer, at least none that were reported. Some of the residents became uncomfortable with the attention and stopped talking about it altogether. Others embellished their almost sightings into full encounters. But those of us who had actually seen it, Dick, Jim, Frank, Joe, and myself, didn't need to exaggerate. What we'd seen was remarkable enough. I've thought about that evening countless times over the years. I've questioned my own senses, wondered if the light or distance played tricks on my eyes. But then I remember the clarity of that 8-power scope, the unmistakable details I observed, and the undeniable intelligence in those eyes. What haunts me most isn't the creature's appearance, but the moment our eyes met. There was recognition there, a mutual acknowledgement. It knew I was watching it, possibly even knew I had the means to harm it, and it made a deliberate choice to withdraw rather than escalate the encounter. In all my years of hunting, I've never experienced anything like that connection with any animal. Bears, deer, elk. They might sense danger and flee, but this was different. This felt like a meeting of minds across a species barrier. Emily and I moved away from Pinewood Manor the following year, when I got offered a teaching position at a larger school in Portland. I never saw the creature again, though occasionally I'd hear stories from the Dells area about strange sightings or unexplained noises in the forest. I'm 78 years old now. Emily passed away 3 years ago, and I've been sorting through our life's belongings, deciding what to keep and what to pass on. Yesterday, I found my old rifle in the back of the closet. I haven't hunted since 1982, when a back injury made trekking through the woods too painful. Holding that rifle, I remembered that evening in 1971 with perfect clarity. I remembered looking through that scope and seeing something that shouldn't exist according to science. but undeniably did exist right in front of me. I've never sought publicity for my experience. I've never gone looking for proof or joined any Sasquatch hunting groups. What would be the point? I know what I saw. Dick Ball, Jim Forkin, Frank Verlander, and Joe Medarios knew what they saw. That's enough for me. But as I get older, I feel compelled to share this experience, to put it on record somewhere before my memory fades, or I'm no longer here to tell it. There are things in this world that defy our neat categorizations, that exist in the margins between what we think we know and what actually is. That creature, that being, was real. It lived in the forests and mountains around the Dells, at least in 1971. Perhaps it still does, or its descendants do. It was intelligent enough to avoid human contact most of the time, to move primarily at dusk or dawn, to observe us from a distance. What strikes me now, looking back from the perspective of age, is how unafraid I felt in that moment. There was awe, certainly. Shock, definitely. But not terror. Not the fear you'd expect when confronted with something so outside your experience. Instead, there was a strange sense of privilege, the feeling that I was witnessing something few people ever get to see. I've never been back to Pinewood Manor or the Dells. I don't know if the trailer court still exists, or if it's been replaced by newer development. The wilderness areas have probably shrunk as towns expanded. I wonder if there's still room out there for creatures that wish to remain hidden, or if we've finally pushed them into the last remote corners. Sometimes, when I'm half asleep, I can still see those eyes looking at me through the trees. Not threatening, not fearful, just aware, conscious, present. It's a memory that doesn't frighten me, but reminds me of how little we truly know about the world we inhabit. I don't expect everyone who reads this to believe me. That's fine. I'm not trying to convince anyone or prove anything. I'm simply sharing what happened on that June evening in 1971, when for 5 minutes I observed through my rifle scope a creature that shouldn't exist, but undeniably did. A creature that looked back at me with intelligence in its eyes, made a decision, and walked away. And sometimes, in my dreams, I follow it into those woods, to see where it goes and how it lives in the hidden places between our world and the wilderness. But then I wake up, back in reality, left only with questions that will likely remain unanswered for the rest of my life. Story 5. I still can't talk about what happened that day in July 1971 without getting the chills. It's been over 50 years now, and sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night sweating, thinking I can still smell that awful stench. Mary and I have barely spoken about it since then. We made a pact not to tell anyone except close family, because we didn't want to be labeled as those crazy women. But I need to get this off my chest now. Maybe someone out there has experienced something similar. Mary and I were best friends since high school. We both worked at the Missouri Bell Telephone Company in St. Louis, and we'd take day trips on weekends to escape the city heat. That Sunday was scorching hot, probably around 95 degrees. We decided to drive my old Volkswagen Beetle up Highway 79 for a picnic near Louisiana, Missouri. It was a charming little town along the Mississippi, and the drive there was beautiful, all rolling hills and farmland. We left early that morning around 8. I remember we were both excited because we'd been working overtime for weeks, and this was our first real day off in ages. I brought my new wicker picnic basket, a birthday gift from my sister, packed with sandwiches, potato salad, and a thermos of lemonade. Mary brought her portable radio so we could listen to music. Highway 79 was practically deserted that day. We only passed maybe 3 or 4 cars during the entire drive north. About 15 miles south of Louisiana, we spotted this perfect little clearing just off the road. It wasn't an official picnic area or anything, just a grassy spot with some shade trees that looked inviting. I pulled the Beetle onto the gravel shoulder, and we carried our stuff about 30 feet from the road to a flat area where we could spread our blanket. The spot was prettier up close, wildflowers everywhere, butterflies flitting around, tall grass waving in the breeze. There was a dense patch of woods behind us, maybe 50 yards away, and the road in front. It felt private and peaceful. I remember thinking how lucky we were to find such a perfect spot, all to ourselves. We laid out our red and white checkered blanket and set up our little picnic. Mary turned on the radio. They were playing Joy to the World by Three Dog Night. We were laughing and talking about work drama, completely relaxed. I was spreading peanut butter on bread for sandwiches while Mary poured lemonade into plastic cups. That's when everything changed. The wind shifted and this smell hit us. God, I can't even describe how awful it was. Like roadkill that had been baking in the sun for days, mixed with the worst body odor you can imagine, and something else, something wild and musky. Mary gagged immediately. I covered my nose with my shirt. "What is that?" Mary said, her face scrunched up. "Did something die nearby?" I stood up, looking around for a dead animal or maybe a skunk. "It smells like a whole family of skunks had a party and died," I joked, trying to lighten the mood. But I was already feeling uneasy. The smell was so intense, so wrong. Mary was scanning the area too, and then her face just froze. Her eyes got wide, fixed on something behind me. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. I'll never forget that look of pure terror. "Joe," she whispered finally. Her voice was so small. "Don't move. There's something in the bushes watching us." I turned slowly, following her gaze toward the edge of the woods. At first I didn't see anything. Then I noticed the weeds moving, about waist high, maybe 40 feet away. And then I saw it. It was partially hidden behind a tree, but I could clearly see a massive figure, standing upright, peering at us from the wood's edge. It was tall, way taller than any man I'd ever seen, 7 feet at least, maybe more, and broad, shoulders like a linebacker. But what made my heart stop was that it wasn't a man. It wasn't a bear either. Its entire body was covered in dark, reddish-brown hair or fur, not like a costume, but actual fur growing from its skin. The face, though, the face is what haunts me. It was almost human-like, but not quite. A prominent brow ridge shadowed deep-set eyes. Its nose was wide and flat, but the eyes, they were intelligent, aware, watching us with what looked like curiosity. "Oh my God," I whispered. "What is that thing?" Mary grabbed my arm so tight I later found bruises. It's like half ape and half man," she hissed. As if it heard us talking about it, the creature suddenly stepped forward, fully emerging from the tree line. That's when we could see its full size. It was enormous, muscular legs, powerful arms that hung lower than a human's would, massive shoulders, and a head that seemed to sit directly on those shoulders with hardly any neck. My whole body went cold with fear. This wasn't possible. Creatures like this didn't exist in Missouri. They didn't exist anywhere except in movies and tabloid papers. Yet there it was, standing not 40 feet from our picnic blanket. The thing made a noise then, a deep gurgling sound that rose into something like a moan. It took another step toward us, then another. "The car!" Mary whispered frantically. "We need to get to the car!" I nodded, unable to speak. We began to back away slowly, not taking our eyes off the creature. It continued its approach, each step deliberate, those eyes locked on us. When it was about 30 feet away, Mary broke. "Run!" she screamed, and we both turned and sprinted toward my beetle. I've never run so fast in my life. I could hear heavy footsteps behind us, thudding impacts on the ground that were getting closer. The car seemed a million miles away. We reached the Volkswagen and yanked open the doors, throwing ourselves inside. I slammed my door shut and hit the lock. Mary did the same. We were both hyperventilating, shaking. That's when I realized the keys, the damn keys were in my purse, and my purse was still sitting next to the picnic basket. "The keys," I gasped. "They're still out there." Mary let out a sob. Through the windshield, We watched in horror as the creature approached our abandoned picnic. It was moving more cautiously now, sniffing the air. The radio was still playing "It's Too Late" by Carole King, creating this surreal soundtrack to our nightmare. The beast circled our blanket, examining our food with obvious interest. It crouched down, a strangely human movement, and picked up one of the peanut butter sandwiches I'd been making. It sniffed the sandwich, then crammed the entire thing into its mouth. One gulp and it was gone. "It's eating our lunch," Mary whispered, almost hysterically. The situation was so absurd that for a split second I felt like laughing. Here we were, trapped in my car, watching Bigfoot eat our picnic lunch. But then the creature turned its attention to us, and any urge to laugh vanished instantly. It approached the car slowly, that terrible smell growing stronger with every step. I rolled up my window quickly. Mary did the same. We were trapped in a tin can, and this thing was coming right for us. When it reached the car, it bent down to peer through the windshield at us. Its face was just feet away, separated only by glass. Those eyes, they weren't animal eyes. There was something in them. Intelligence, curiosity, something I couldn't name. It tilted its head slightly, studying us. Then it placed one massive hand on the hood of my Beetle. The car actually dipped under its weight. Its fingers were huge, with dirty nails that looked almost like claws. It ran its hand across the metal as if feeling the texture. Next, it moved to the driver's side where I sat frozen in terror. It bent down again to look directly at me through the window. Our eyes met. I couldn't breathe. It reached for the door handle and tugged. Thank God the doors were locked. The creature seemed confused when the door wouldn't open. It tried again, harder this time, making the whole car shake. "Do something," Mary hissed. In desperation, I slammed my hand on the horn. The sudden blaring noise made the creature jump backwards, startled. It let out that gurgling moan again, but louder, almost a growl. I kept my hand on the horn, and the beast maintained its distance, watching us warily. When I finally released the horn, it didn't immediately approach again. Instead, it turned its attention back to our picnic. That's when it spotted my purse, a brown leather shoulder bag my mother had given me for Christmas. It walked over and picked it up, turning it around in its hands like a child with a new toy. My heart sank as I realized the car keys were inside, along with my wallet and all my identification. The creature sniffed the purse, then tucked it under one arm. It started walking toward the woods. "No, no, no," I moaned. "It's taking my purse." Mary and I watched helplessly as the beast lumbered away with my bag. But then, strangest of all, about 10 steps from the tree line, it suddenly dropped the purse onto the ground. It looked back at us one more time, let out another of those moaning sounds, and then continued into the woods until it disappeared among the trees. We sat in stunned silence for several minutes, afraid to move, afraid it might come back. The only sound was the radio, still playing cheerfully as if nothing had happened. "Is it gone?" Mary finally whispered. "I think so," I said, but I wasn't sure. We waited another excruciating 15 minutes, watching the tree line. Nothing moved except the breeze through the leaves. "Someone needs to get the keys," Mary said finally. "I'll go," I replied, my voice shaking. "I'll run, grab my purse, and run back. If that thing comes out again, you lean on the horn." Mary nodded, sliding into the driver's seat as I prepared to exit the passenger side. My legs felt like jelly. I took a deep breath, unlocked the door, and burst out of the car. I sprinted to my purse, snatched it up, and ran back without looking toward the woods. The whole time I expected to feel massive hands grabbing me from behind, but nothing happened. I made it back to the car, gasping for breath. My hands shook so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. When the engine roared to life, we both cried out in relief. I threw the car into reverse, spinning gravel as I backed onto Highway 79, then shifted into drive and floored it. We left our picnic things behind. The blanket, the basket, everything. I didn't care. I just wanted to get away. We drove in silence for several miles, both of us processing what had just happened. Finally, Mary spoke. "What was that thing, Joe?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever those things are supposed to be called. I never believed they were real." "Me neither," Mary whispered. "But that was real. That happened." We debated whether to report it to the police in Louisiana. But what would we say? That we were attacked by Bigfoot? They'd think we were drunk or on drugs. So we kept driving all the way back to St. Louis, jumping at every shadow on the road. For weeks afterward, I had nightmares about those eyes staring at me through the car window. I threw away the clothes I'd been wearing that day because I couldn't get that smell out of them. Mary and I made a pact not to tell anyone except our closest family members, and even then, some of them clearly didn't believe us. Over the years, I've read accounts of similar encounters. Some people call these creatures Sasquatch or Bigfoot. Some indigenous peoples have their own names for them. I don't know what to call what we saw that day, but I know it was real. Sometimes I wonder why it didn't just smash the car windows to get to us. It certainly looked strong enough, and why did it drop my purse instead of taking it into the woods? It's almost like it was curious about us, but didn't want to hurt us. I've never gone back to that spot on Highway 79. I sold that Volkswagen 6 months later because I couldn't stand being in it anymore. It reminded me too much of being trapped, helpless, while that creature examined us like specimens in a zoo. Mary moved to California in 1974, and we gradually lost touch. The last time we spoke, about 10 years ago, she told me she still couldn't eat peanut butter sandwiches. I'm 78 years old now, and I've never told this story publicly before. But I need people to know there are things in this world that we don't understand, things that shouldn't exist but do. I know because I saw one that Sunday in July 1971, on a quiet stretch of Highway 79 near Louisiana, Missouri, and not a day goes by that I don't think about those intelligent eyes looking back at me through my car window. Story 6. I've been holding this inside for too long. I need to tell someone. I'm 40 years old now, and I've never spoken about this to anyone except my husband, who thinks I saw some bears or I'm making it up. I know what I saw that day. I know it wasn't bears, it wasn't people in costumes, and it certainly wasn't my imagination. This happened in August of 1996. I was 12 years old, living in Shelton, Washington. If you've never been there, it's this small, quiet town surrounded by forests and mountains. Beautiful place, but isolated in many ways. My family had property there, not a farm exactly, but we had a good amount of land with woods around it. That summer, I was spending a lot of time with my older cousin Daniel, who was 17 at the time. My parents both worked long hours, so I'd often go help Daniel do field work around the property. He'd let me tag along while he cleared brush, checked fences, that sort of thing. I thought I was so grown up being his assistant. The day it happened was brutally hot. One of those clear, scorching August days where the air feels too thick to breathe. We'd been working for maybe 3 hours when Daniel realized we were out of water. Our house was maybe a quarter-mile away, down this narrow dirt path that cut between a field of tall grass and some scattered trees. "Emma, can you run back and get us some water?" Daniel asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I need to finish this section before we break." I remember feeling annoyed because I was tired and hot too, but I nodded and took the empty water bottle from him. The path was overgrown, and the grass was nearly as tall as I was in some spots. I could barely see over it as I walked. The ground was dry and cracked beneath my sneakers. I'd made that walk 100 times before. Nothing unusual ever happened. The path eventually connected to a small gravel road that led to our house. The road wasn't really used by anyone except my family and maybe the occasional neighbor. I was almost to the road, maybe 50 feet away from where the dirt path met the gravel, when something made me stop. I didn't hear anything specific. In fact, it was the opposite. The woods had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects buzzing, nothing, just that heavy, hot air. When I stepped out onto the gravel road, I saw them. They were standing side by side, just watching me. They were maybe 10 feet away, close enough that I could see every detail, every blink of their eyes. My first thought was, those are some weird kids. But within seconds, I knew they weren't kids. They weren't people at all. There were two of them. The taller one was probably about 5 feet tall, not much bigger than me. The smaller one was maybe 4 feet. They stood upright, completely vertical, not hunched over. Their bodies were covered in this dark brown hair, not fur exactly, more like hair that grew all over their bodies. It wasn't matted or dirty. It had this slight shine to it in the sunlight. Their faces, though, God, their faces. They had dark skin showing through. Their faces weren't completely covered with hair like the rest of them. Their noses were broad and flat with visible dark skin. Their eyes were, I don't even know how to describe them. Deep set, dark, but so aware, intelligent. They blinked slowly, deliberately. Their hands hung at their sides. They had these long fingers with dark skin visible on their palms. They didn't make a sound. They didn't move toward me or away from me. They just stood there, staring. I remember thinking they looked like curious children, the way they were watching me. There was no aggression, no fear, just this intense curiosity. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just stood there staring back at them. Time seemed to stretch out forever, but I think it was probably less than a minute that we all stood there looking at each other. What strikes me even now was how still they were. They barely moved, except for those slow blinks. They were so comfortable in their stillness, like they could have stood there forever without getting tired or fidgeting. Then something inside me snapped. Pure panic flooded through my body. I turned and ran back down the path without looking behind me. I ran so hard my lungs burned and my legs felt like they might give out. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me, but there was nothing. I burst into our house, slamming the door behind me. My mum was at work, and my dad was out somewhere with neighbors. I was alone, shaking, trying to catch my breath. I remember leaning against the kitchen counter, trying to process what I'd just seen. Daniel would be waiting for water. I couldn't leave him out there alone, not knowing what was in the woods, but I was terrified to go back outside. It took me about 15 minutes to gather my courage. I filled a big glass with water, took a couple deep breaths, and forced myself to walk back out the door. This time I stayed on the main gravel road instead of the path through the tall grass. I walked slowly, my eyes darting to every movement in the trees, every rustling sound in the brush. My hands were shaking so badly that water sloshed over the sides of the glass. When I got to the spot where I'd seen them, they were gone. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign they'd ever been there at all. The road was just empty gravel, baking in the sun. I found Daniel exactly where I'd left him, irritated that I'd taken so long. "What happened to you?" he asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I opened my mouth to tell him, but something stopped me. I don't know why I didn't tell him right then. Maybe I was afraid he wouldn't believe me. Maybe I thought he'd laugh at me. Or worse, maybe he'd tell my parents and they'd think I was making it up for attention. "I thought I saw a bear," I mumbled, handing him the glass. "But it was just a shadow." Daniel rolled his eyes. "There haven't been bears around here in years, Emma." For days afterward, I could barely sleep. Every noise outside my window made me freeze. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, trying to convince myself that maybe I had seen something else. Raccoons standing on their hind legs, or some neighborhood kids playing a prank. But I knew what I'd seen. The thing that stays with me most was their eyes. They weren't animal eyes. They had this awareness to them. Like they were thinking, evaluating, understanding. That's what makes me absolutely certain they weren't bears or any other animal. What was even stranger was that this happened in broad daylight, on a road near houses. not deep in some remote wilderness where you might expect something like this to hide. They were right there, in the open, in the middle of the day. I didn't tell anyone about it for years. When I was in college, I started researching online, looking at reports of Sasquatch sightings. Most accounts describe massive, 7-foot-tall creatures, not the juvenile-sized beings I saw that day. But everything else lined up. The hair, the facial features, the human-like quality to their movements and posture. The older I get, the more I'm convinced of what I saw. I've read accounts of others who've seen younger Sasquatch, and the descriptions match my experience almost exactly. The juvenile proportions, the curious behavior, the lack of aggression. Sometimes I wonder if they lived in those woods all along, watching us as we went about our lives, completely unaware of their presence. How many times had I walked that path, thinking I was alone? I've driven back to Shelton a few times over the years. The last time I visited, about 5 years ago, much of the forest had been cleared for new housing developments. The field with the tall grass is now somebody's backyard. Our old property has been divided up and sold off piece by piece. I wonder where they went when the chainsaws came and the bulldozers started clearing the land. Did they move deeper into the mountains, or were they already gone by then? I still can't explain why I felt no immediate danger during that encounter. They could have easily overpowered me. Even as juveniles, they were my size or larger. But they seemed content just to observe. There was this strange moment of connection between us, like we were equally fascinated with each other. I've never gone camping or hiking since that day. I can't bring myself to be alone in the woods anymore. My husband thinks it's silly, but he doesn't understand. He didn't see their eyes. He didn't feel that primal recognition, that moment of looking at something that's not supposed to exist, but clearly does. For years, I questioned my own memory, convinced myself it couldn't have happened. But as time passes, the memory doesn't fade or distort like childhood imaginings do. It remains crystal clear, every detail preserved. The heaviness of the air, the absolute silence in the woods, the way the taller one shifted its weight slightly from one foot to the other while watching me. I know what I saw that day. 2 juvenile Sasquatch standing on that gravel road in broad daylight, watching me with those intelligent, curious eyes. For nearly 28 years, I've carried this secret, afraid of the ridicule, afraid people would think I was crazy or attention-seeking. But I know what I saw, and now, finally, I've told someone. Sometimes I wonder if they remember me too, that scared 12-year-old girl who stared back at them for what felt like an eternity before running away in terror. I wonder if somewhere in the mountains around Shelton, they're still out there, grown now, perhaps with young ones of their own. And sometimes, especially on hot August days when the air feels too thick to breathe, I find myself thinking about those few moments on the gravel road. Those moments when I stood face to face with something that wasn't supposed to exist. Those moments that changed how I see the world forever. I haven't been back to Shelton in years, and I don't think I ever will go back. Not because I'm afraid of seeing them again, but because I'm afraid I won't. Afraid that the magic and mystery of that encounter has been bulldozed away, along with the trees and tall grass. But in my mind, they're still there, forever frozen in that moment on the road, watching me with those knowing eyes, their dark hair shining slightly in the August sun. Story 7. I still get goosebumps thinking about that night in September 2009. It's been 14 years, but I remember it like it happened yesterday. I've never shared this publicly before, but after seeing so many similar accounts here, I figured it's time to tell someone who might actually believe me. My name's Melissa. I was 32 back then, living with my husband Marcus and our 2 kids. Emma was 7 and Jake was 5, in a small house about 15 minutes outside of Kamiah, Idaho. It's one of those blink and you miss it towns, surrounded by dense forests and mountains. We'd been visiting my parents, who lived about 3 hours away. They were getting older and my dad had some health problems, so we tried to visit at least once a month. The visit had gone longer than planned. You know how family gatherings can be, and we ended up leaving way later than I wanted to. It was already dark when we hit the road around 11 at night. Marcus offered to drive, but he'd worked a double shift at the lumber mill the day before and was exhausted. He kept nodding off in the passenger seat, so I told him to just sleep, and I'd wake him when we were close to home. The kids conked out almost immediately in the back seat of our old Subaru station wagon. Emma had her head against the window with her favorite stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin, and Jake was slumped in his booster seat with his mouth hanging open. The radio was playing softly, some late-night talk show that was just loud enough to keep me company without waking everyone up. Everything was normal for most of the drive, just your typical nighttime drive through rural Idaho. But when we got about 30 minutes from home, the fog started rolling in. Not your average fog either. This was the kind that makes you feel like you're driving through soup. I slowed down to about 40 miles per hour, sometimes even slower when it got really thick. The headlights weren't helping much. They just reflected back at me, making it even harder to see. I remember checking the clock on the dashboard, 3:24 a.m. I was tired, my eyes were burning, and all I could think about was getting home and crawling into bed. The road was completely empty, no other cars in either direction, just our headlights cutting through that thick wall of white. I had both hands gripping the steering wheel, leaning forward trying to see better. That's when I saw it. I was coming around this gentle curve where the forest pushes right up against the road. There's no shoulder there, just a shallow ditch and then trees. The fog had thinned out just slightly, enough that I could see maybe 30 feet ahead instead of 10. At first I thought it was just a tree stump or maybe a bear standing up. But as we got closer, I realized it was standing right at the edge of the road. My headlights caught it for maybe 3-4 seconds tops as we approached. But in that moment, I knew I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. It was huge. I'm not exaggerating when I say it must have been at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. It was standing with its back to the road, just perfectly still. The thing that struck me immediately was its head, or rather, the lack of a normal head. It just had this cone-shaped, I don't even know how to describe it, like its head just extended up from its shoulders in this weird point. No neck at all that I could see. The shoulders were massive, way wider than any human's. Its arms hung down at its sides, but they seemed too long, like they would reach past its knees if it turned around. The whole body was covered in this thick, matted fur or hair. Dark brown or maybe black. It's hard to say in the headlights and fog. But the way the light hit it was weird. It kind of reflected, almost like when you shine a light on a wet dog at night, but not quite that shiny. I remember wondering why it was just standing there, facing the forest with its back to the road. It didn't even turn or acknowledge our car as we drove past, just standing perfectly still like some kind of sentinel. I didn't wake anyone up. I don't know why. Maybe shock. Maybe I didn't want to scare the kids. I just kept driving, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, checking the rearview mirror every 2 seconds. But the fog had closed in again, and within moments, whatever that thing was had disappeared from view. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I kept telling myself I was tired, that it was just a bear, or maybe even a person in a coat. But I knew better. Bears don't stand like that. People don't have bodies shaped like that, and neither bears nor people stand motionless at the edge of a deserted road at 3:30 in the morning during heavy fog. The next 20 minutes of driving were the longest of my life. I kept scanning the roadside, terrified I'd see it again, or worse, that it would be running alongside the car or something, but there was nothing. Just fog and empty road, When we finally pulled into our driveway, I sat there for a minute with the engine running. Our house never looked so good. Just a simple two-story with a porch light we always left on when we were out. I remember staring at that light like it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I shook Marcus awake. He startled, looking around, confused for a second. "We're home," I said, my voice shakier than I expected. "Already?" He rubbed his eyes. "Why are you looking at me like that? What's wrong?" I didn't want to say it out loud with the kids right there, even though they were still asleep. "I need to talk to you inside. Help me with the kids." We carried Emma and Jake to their beds without waking them up, which felt like a small miracle. As soon as I closed their bedroom doors, I grabbed Marcus by the arm and pulled him into our kitchen. "I saw something on the road," I whispered. Marcus looked concerned. "What, like a deer? Did you hit something?" "No," I shook my head. I think I saw a Sasquatch." Now I should explain that Marcus had been obsessed with Bigfoot since he was a kid. He had books about cryptids all over the house. He'd even gone on a couple of those Bigfoot hunting weekends with his buddies from work. He was always trying to get me to watch documentaries about Sasquatch sightings, but I'd never been interested. I always thought it was just a fun hobby for him, nothing real. His eyes widened. "Are you serious? Where? How far from here?" I described the location, about 7 miles from our house, on that curvy stretch of road where Mill Creek Forest pushes up against the pavement. I told him exactly what I'd seen: the weird cone-shaped head, the massive shoulders, the height, everything. Marcus was practically vibrating with excitement. "That's a classic Sasquatch description. The conical head is reported in a lot of sightings. They call it a sagittal crest. It's where their jaw muscles attach. And the hair reflecting light, that's another common report." "Marcus, it was fucking terrifying," I cut in. "This wasn't cool or exciting. It was standing there like it was waiting for something." He immediately softened, putting his hands on my shoulders. "I'm sorry, you're right. Are you okay?" I wasn't. I was shaking. He made me sit down while he got me a glass of water. "We need to go back there," he said after a minute. "Get photos. Look for tracks." "Now? Are you insane? It's almost 4 in the morning." "That's the best time. If it's still in the area..." "No way," I said firmly. "The kids are asleep. I'm exhausted, and I'm not going back there right now." We argued about it for a bit, but eventually Marcus could see I was genuinely shaken up. He agreed to wait until first light, then go check it out while I stayed with the kids. I couldn't sleep at all. I kept seeing that thing standing by the roadside, imagining it turning around, wondering what its face looked like. Marcus tried to comfort me, telling me that Sasquatch aren't known to be aggressive toward humans, that most sightings are just brief glimpses like mine. But it didn't help much. Around 6 a.m., when the sky was just starting to lighten, Marcus kissed me goodbye and headed out with his camera, a measuring tape, and a plaster kit for taking casts of footprints. I made him promise to be back by 8 when the kids would be waking up. He came back at 7:30, disappointed. The fog had cleared up, but he couldn't find any evidence. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. He walked up and down that stretch of road twice. "It rained a little while I was out there," he explained. "Might have washed away any tracks, or maybe it never came onto the road itself." For the next few weeks, Marcus was obsessed. He drove out to that spot almost every day after work. He put up a trail camera tied to a tree on the forest edge. He even reported the sighting to some Bigfoot research group online. Nothing ever came of it, though. The trail camera only caught deer and a few raccoons. But here's the thing. In the months after my sighting, I started hearing stories from other people in Camier. A trucker who saw something large cross the highway about 5 miles from where I had my encounter. A teenager who was camping with friends and woke up to find their cooler had been opened and emptied in the night, with weird footprints around their campsite. An old woman who lived on the edge of town who said something had been walking around her property at night, looking in her windows. None of these people knew about my experience. I hadn't told anyone except Marcus. I didn't drive that road at night for almost a year afterward. I'd make excuses to leave my parents earlier, or we'd stay overnight if it got too late. Marcus thought I was being irrational, but he didn't push it. 14 years later, and I still get nervous driving through foggy stretches of road at night. I still wonder what that thing was doing there, just standing and staring into the forest. Was it watching something, listening, waiting? What bothers me most is how still it was. It didn't react to our headlights, didn't turn to look at the car, didn't move at all. Almost like it wanted to be seen but didn't want to interact. Or maybe it was so focused on whatever it was watching in the forest that our passing car wasn't worth its attention. I've read accounts from other people who've seen similar creatures, and many describe them moving quickly, running away, or showing some kind of reaction to human presence. But this one, it was just standing there, completely still, like a statue. That's what made it so unnerving. Marcus still has his Bigfoot books and watches all the shows about Sasquatch sightings. Sometimes he'll call me into the room when someone describes seeing one with a conical head saying, "See? Just like what you saw." But I don't need the confirmation. I know what I saw that night. The kids are grown now. Emma's in college and Jake's about to graduate high school. We never told them about it. What would be the point? They'd either think I was crazy or get freaked out unnecessarily. I haven't seen anything like it since that night. Part of me hopes I never do again. But another part of me still watches the tree line when we drive past that stretch of road, especially in fog. I can't help it. That night changed how I see the world. There are things out there we don't understand, things that shouldn't exist according to what we're taught. But they do. They're out there in the forests, watching us as we drive by, standing motionless in the fog. Sometimes I wonder if it's still there in that same spot waiting. For what, I don't know. And I don't think I want to find out. Story 8. I still remember the exact day it happened. June 29th, 1992. I was 10 years old, and my little sister Sarah was 7. It was one of those perfect summer evenings in Idaho, the kind where the sun stays up forever and the air feels like it's hugging you. Mom had made lemonade earlier, and Sarah and I had been running around our yard all afternoon playing tag and hide and seek. We lived in this really isolated spot outside Tenson, Idaho. Our house sat on this big property with woods all around it and a creek that ran along the back edge of our land. Dad always said we were lucky kids to have our own wilderness playground, but he also had rules. The main one was that we weren't supposed to go into the woods alone, especially not past the creek. That evening, Mom was inside preparing dinner and Dad was fixing something in the garage. Sarah and I were bored with our usual games and the creek was calling to us. I remember looking at the trail that followed alongside it, disappearing into the trees, and thinking how cool it would be to explore a little further than we usually did. "Let's follow the creek path," I said to Sarah. "Just for a few minutes." Sarah was always up for an adventure, especially if her big brother suggested it. So we snuck away from the yard, following the narrow dirt path that ran beside the water. The trees got thicker pretty quickly, and the sounds of our house, Mom banging pots in the kitchen, Dad's radio playing in the garage, faded away behind us. We'd been down this path before, but never this far. The creek bent around a curve, and suddenly we found ourselves in this perfect little clearing, maybe 50 feet across, with tall grass waving in the gentle breeze. The sun was still bright enough to fill the whole space with golden light. It was like something from a storybook. Sarah immediately started picking wildflowers that grew at the edge of the clearing, and I was skipping rocks across a wider part of the creek. Everything felt so peaceful, just the sound of water, birds, and Sarah humming some song she'd learned at school. I was just about to tell Sarah we should head back before Mom called us for dinner when she suddenly went quiet. I turned to look at her, and she was completely still. staring across the clearing toward the trees on the far side. "Tyler," she whispered, not moving her eyes from whatever she was looking at. "Someone's watching us." I followed her gaze, squinting into the shadow of the trees, thinking maybe it was a deer or something. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Then there was movement, not quick or startling, just a slight shifting in the darkness between two pine trees, and then they stepped forward. I've spent 30 years trying to explain what I saw that day, and I still don't have the right words, but I'll try to be as clear and accurate as possible. Two figures moved out from the tree line. They were standing upright on two legs, just like people, but they weren't people, not at all. The taller one was maybe 5 feet tall, and the smaller one was about 4 feet. Both were covered completely in dark brown hair, not fur exactly, but more like long hair that covered their entire bodies. The hair wasn't shaggy like a bear's, but more uniform, hanging straight down, especially on their arms. And those arms, they hung down almost to their knees. Their hands were visible at the ends of those arms, and that's one of the details that's burned into my memory. They had hands like ours, with fingers and opposable thumbs, but they were bigger, more powerful looking in proportion to their bodies. Their legs were shorter and thicker, ending in large feet that resembled oversized human feet, but wider and flatter. I remember thinking they looked like they'd leave footprints twice the size of my dad's work boots. But it was their faces that really got to me. They had these broad, flat faces with wide noses and deep-set eyes beneath heavy brow ridges. Their foreheads sloped back, and the hair on their heads continued down around their faces almost like a mane. Their eyes were dark. I couldn't see a color from that distance, but they were undeniably intelligent eyes. Watching, studying, thinking. I realized I was holding my breath. Beside me, Sarah had frozen with a half-picked flower still in her hand. We both just stood there, and the two creatures stood there. And for what felt like forever, nobody moved. They made no sound. No growling, no chattering, no calls. They just stood at the edge of the clearing, watching us with what I can only describe as curiosity. There was no aggression in their posture. They weren't approaching us or threatening us in any way. They were just observing. I don't know how long we all stayed like that. Maybe 30 seconds, a minute. Time gets weird in moments like that. But eventually, my big brother instinct kicked in. I reached out slowly and took Sarah's hand, never taking my eyes off the creatures. "We need to go," I whispered to her. "Walk backward, really slow." Sarah's little hand squeezed mine so tight it hurt, but she did exactly what I said. We backed away, step by step, toward the path we'd come from. The creatures didn't move, they just kept watching. When we reached the edge of the clearing where the path went back into the trees toward our house, I finally turned around, still holding Sarah's hand, and we started walking faster. "Don't run yet," I told her, even though every part of me wanted to sprint, just a little farther. We kept up this fast walk until we couldn't see the clearing anymore, and then we ran. We ran like I've never run before or since, crashing through branches, splashing through the shallow parts of the creek where the path crossed it, not caring about getting wet or scratched by thorns. My only thought was getting Sarah back to the yard, back to safety. By the time our house came into view, we were both gasping for breath. We burst out from the tree line into our backyard, and I remember feeling this flood of relief at seeing the normal, everyday sight of our house with the kitchen light on and smoke coming from the chimney where Dad must have started a fire in the fireplace. We ran straight to the back door and practically fell into the kitchen. Mom was at the stove stirring something, and she turned around with this alarmed look on her face. "What in the world happened to you two?" she asked, taking in our scratched arms, wet shoes, and terrified expressions. I tried to explain, but the words came tumbling out in a confused mess. Sarah was crying now, the delayed reaction hitting her all at once. Dad heard the commotion and came in from the living room. "There were people in the woods," Sarah sobbed, "but not people. Hairy people." Dad immediately went into action mode. He grabbed his jacket and flashlight, even though it was still light outside. "Show me where," he said, his voice serious in a way that made me realize he believed us, or at least believed we had seen something that scared us. I didn't want to go back, but I led Dad to the edge of our yard and pointed toward the trail. "Down there, by the creek, in the clearing." Dad told us to stay with Mom, and he disappeared down the path. He was gone for about 20 minutes, which felt like hours. Sarah and I sat at the kitchen table, drinking the hot chocolate Mom had made us, even though it was summer. Neither of us said much. I kept seeing those creatures in my mind, standing so still, watching us with those intelligent eyes. When Dad came back, his expression was hard to read. He sat down at the table with us. "I didn't see any people," he said carefully. "But something was definitely there. The grass is all flattened in 2 spots right where you said they were standing, and there's some broken branches and disturbed underbrush leading away into the forest." Mom looked worried. "Should we call someone? The police?" Dad hesitated. "And tell them what? That the kids saw some hairy creatures in the woods. They'll think we're crazy." "They weren't bears, Dad," I insisted. "They were standing up, like people. And they had hands. Real hands." Dad looked at me for a long time, then nodded slowly. "I believe you saw something, Tyler. I just don't know what it was." That night, I couldn't sleep. My bedroom window faced the woods, and I kept the curtains tightly closed. I could hear Sarah crying in her room next door, and eventually Mum let her sleep in their bed. The next day we tried to go back to normal, but things were different. Our golden retriever Max, who usually loved running in the woods, refused to go near the trail. When Dad tried to take him for their usual walk, Max planted his feet at the start of the path and wouldn't budge. He started growling toward the woods, his hackles raised. After that, he wouldn't even go into the yard without one of us right beside him. About a week after our encounter, we started hearing the knocks. They always came in the evening, usually after dinner when we were sitting in the living room. 3 distinct wood-on-wood knocks, coming from different directions in the forest around our property. Sometimes they seemed to be answering each other. One series of knocks from the east, then another from the west side of the woods. Dad said it was probably just woodpeckers, but woodpeckers don't knock at night, and they don't make sounds that loud and deliberate. These were powerful, like someone hitting a tree trunk with a baseball bat. The worst part was the feeling of being watched. Whenever I went into the yard that summer, the hair on the back of my neck would stand up. I'd get this prickly sensation between my shoulder blades, like someone was staring at me. But when I turned around, there was never anything there, just the silent edge of the forest. Sarah and I never saw the creatures again, but that one encounter changed us forever. We never went back to that clearing. We barely even went into the yard alone that summer. Mom and Dad were worried about us, I could tell. They tried to convince us it had been bears or maybe some hunters in ghillie suits, though that explanation made no sense at all. As the weeks passed, I kept thinking about those creatures. Their intelligent eyes, the careful way they watched us, how they made no move to harm us when they easily could have. They hadn't acted like monsters or wild animals. They'd acted like curious beings who had stumbled across 2 human children and wanted to observe us. I started looking for information about what we might have seen. This was 1992, long before the internet was in every home, so I checked out books from the library about mysterious creatures and unexplained phenomena. And that's when I first came across the word Sasquatch, or Bigfoot, as most people call them. The descriptions matched what we'd seen, except for one thing. Most sightings were of adult creatures, 7 or 8 feet tall. What we had seen were smaller, juvenile versions. Young Sasquatches, perhaps siblings like Sarah and me, who had been curious enough to reveal themselves. Nobody outside our family knows this story. I'm 30 now, and Sarah's 27. And we've never told anyone else except our spouses. People would think we were making it up or that we had active imaginations as kids. But we know what we saw. Our parents sold that house when I was in high school, and I've never been back to Tenson. Sometimes I wonder if those young creatures are still there, now fully grown, still watching from the forest edge as new families move in and out, never knowing they're being observed. What stays with me most isn't fear, though I was terrified in the moment. What stays with me is the sense that we briefly crossed paths with another intelligent species, one that shares our world but remains hidden, watching us from the shadows of forests across North America. Those creatures could have harmed two defenseless children, but they didn't. They just watched, curious about us as we were about them. I don't expect everyone to believe this account. I probably wouldn't believe it myself if I hadn't lived it. But Sarah and I know what we saw that summer evening in the Idaho woods. And no matter what experts say about the impossibility of an undiscovered primate species in North America, we know they're out there. We looked into their eyes and they looked into ours, and in that moment of connection, both sides recognize the other as more than just an animal. I still get chills when I hear wood knocks in forests, or when I feel watched while hiking. Some primal part of my brain remembers that day and knows we are not alone in the woods. Never have been. Oh. Story 9. I've lived on the outskirts of Roseburg for nearly 14 years now. It's a quiet little spot, tucked away where the forest meets civilization. My house isn't fancy. Just a cozy two-bedroom with a decent yard and a wooden fence separating my property from the dense tree line. I've always loved how peaceful it is here. Just me, my dog Cooper, a stubborn but lovable German Shepherd mix, and the occasional visit from deer or raccoons. But something changed last August, something I still can't fully explain, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to. It started innocently enough. My motion sensor lights began triggering almost every night around 2 in the morning. At first, I thought nothing of it. Probably just deer wandering through, maybe a coyote. Wildlife is common enough around here that I didn't give it much thought. But after the 4th night of lights clicking on at exactly the same time, I started paying attention. Cooper noticed something before I did. He'd wake up right before the lights went on, whining softly at first, then tucking his tail and retreating to the corner of my bedroom. This wasn't normal for him. Cooper's never been afraid of anything. He usually barks his head off at the slightest disturbance. But whatever was out there made him cower instead. That's when I knew something wasn't right. On the 7th night of this pattern, I decided to look for myself. The motion light had just clicked on, flooding my backyard with harsh white light. Cooper was pressed against my leg, trembling slightly. I moved to my bedroom window, which faces the backyard, and carefully pulled back the curtain just enough to peek out. What I saw still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. There, just beyond my fence, were 2 amber-colored eyes staring directly at my window. They weren't low to the ground like a coyote's would be. They had to be at least 6 or 7 feet up, and they didn't reflect the light like an animal's eyes typically do. They absorbed it somehow, glowing from within. Those eyes didn't blink. They didn't move. They just watched. I stood frozen for what must have been a full minute, heart pounding so loud I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. Then I let the curtain fall back and spent the rest of the night sitting up in bed, jumping at every creak and groan of the house settling. The next morning, I went outside to check around the fence. There was nothing obvious at first, no broken branches, no tufts of fur. But as I approached the spot where I'd seen the eyes, I noticed something strange on my fence. There were dark smudges along the top rail, as if something large had been leaning against it. The wood was slightly compressed, and there was a faint, musky odor I couldn't identify. I told myself it was probably just dirt or mold. Maybe a bear had wandered through, though bears aren't common in this immediate area. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been watching me wasn't any normal forest animal. For the next 2 weeks, the same pattern continued. The lights would trigger between 2 and 2:30. Sometimes I'd see those eyes staring unblinking from the tree line. Other times, there would be nothing visible, but I could feel a presence out there. I'd turn on my porch light, hoping to scare whatever it was away, and the eyes would vanish. Cooper grew increasingly anxious, refusing to go into the backyard even during daylight hours. I started taking pictures with my phone, trying to capture whatever was out there, but all I got were blurry shots of darkness. I mentioned it casually to a neighbor who laughed and said, "Probably just teenagers messing around. Or maybe Bigfoot's taken a liking to you." He was joking, but something about that comment stuck with me. Then came August 15th, a date I won't forget. I'd gone to bed early, exhausted from lack of sleep over the previous nights. Cooper was curled up on the floor beside my bed, unusually calm. Maybe we were both just getting used to our nightly visitor. Around 1:30, I woke to a sound I hadn't heard before, a rhythmic thumping along my fence line. Not loud, but consistent. Thump, 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 like something large walking slowly, deliberately. Cooper was instantly alert. His ears perked up, but he made no sound. That scared me more than his whining had. I slipped out of bed and made my way to the kitchen window, which offers the best view of my entire backyard. The motion lights hadn't triggered yet, which was strange given the noise. I didn't turn on any lights inside. Some instinct told me to stay in the darkness. I peered through the window, waiting for my eyes to adjust to the dim moonlight filtering through the trees. That's when I saw it. Standing at the back of my yard, just inside the fence line, was a figure. Not human, at least not entirely. It was tall, far taller than any man I've ever seen. 7 feet at minimum, possibly closer to 8. It had broad shoulders, a massive frame covered in what looked like dark hair or fur. Its arms hung low at its sides, reaching almost to its knees. I couldn't make out facial features clearly in the darkness, but I could feel it looking at my house, studying it. I stood completely still, afraid that any movement might draw its attention directly to me. It just stood there, not moving much, occasionally turning its head slightly as if scanning the property. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few minutes, it seemed to lose interest. Then, in one fluid motion, it stepped over my 4-foot fence like it was nothing more than a small hedge and disappeared into the trees. Only after it vanished did the motion lights finally trigger, illuminating an empty yard. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat in my living room with all the lights on, Cooper pressed against me, jumping at every sound from outside. When dawn finally broke, I ventured into the backyard, Cooper reluctantly following at my heels. There, in the grass where the figure had stood, were 2 large oval impressions. Footprints, I guess you'd call them, though they weren't shaped quite like human feet. They were at least 16 inches long and incredibly deep, like whatever made them was incredibly heavy. The grass was completely flattened, and that same musky smell hung in the air, stronger now. I took photos of the prints with my phone, measuring them against my hand for scale. Then I followed the fence line to where the figure had stepped over. There, on the top rail, was a clear handprint pressed into the wood. Not a human hand. The fingers were too long, the thumb positioned strangely. And embedded in the wood were what looked like coarse, dark hairs. I called in sick to work that day. I couldn't bring myself to leave the house. Instead, I spent hours online, searching for information about strange sightings in the Oregon forests. I discovered that the Roseburg area has actually had numerous reports of Sasquatch sightings over the years. People described creatures matching exactly what I'd seen, tall, broad, covered in dark hair, with a distinctive way of moving. Some reports mentioned the same amber eyes I'd seen. That evening, I went to the hardware store and bought security cameras, the kind that connect to your phone so you can monitor them remotely. I installed them covering my entire backyard, convinced I'd finally get proof of whatever was visiting my property. The first night with the cameras, nothing happened. The second night, the motion lights triggered at the usual time. But the camera feeds all went black simultaneously. When they came back online about 10 minutes later, there was nothing to see. This happened night after night. The cameras would glitch, go dark, or sometimes show nothing but static during the exact period when the motion lights would trigger. On the rare occasions when the cameras did work, they'd capture just a glimpse of something moving at the edge of the frame. Never a clear shot, just a dark blur that could be dismissed as a shadow or camera artifact. It was as if whatever was out there knew exactly how to avoid being recorded. About a week after installing the cameras, I was awakened not by the motion lights, but by a sound on my back porch. A deliberate tapping on the kitchen window. 3 distinct taps, then silence. Cooper didn't whine this time. He growled, low in his throat, but made no move toward the sound. I lay there frozen, listening. 3 more taps, slightly louder. I couldn't bring myself to get up and look. Then I heard what sounded like something being placed on my porch. Heavy footsteps moved away, and the motion lights finally triggered. When morning came, I cautiously opened my back door. There, placed carefully on the porch step, was a dead rabbit. Not mangled or torn apart, just placed there, as if left as some kind of offering, gift, warning. I have no idea, but it terrified me. I called my sister in Portland, trying to explain what was happening without sounding completely insane. She suggested I stay with her for a while, get away from whatever was going on. I almost took her up on it, but some stubborn part of me didn't want to be driven from my home by fear. This was my place. I'd been here for 14 years without any problems. Instead, I called a local hunting guide I'd met a few times through work. Without giving too many details, I asked about unusual wildlife activity in the area. Had he seen anything strange lately? He hesitated before answering. Look, we don't talk about this much, but there's been sightings, more than usual this year. Whatever's out there, it's best to just leave it be. They don't bother people who don't bother them. That night, I left my outdoor lights on all night. I thought it might deter whatever was visiting, but instead, it seemed to embolden it. Around 2 in the morning, I heard heavy footsteps circling my house. Slow, deliberate steps that paused at each window before moving on. When they reached my bedroom window, they stopped. I could hear deep, heavy breathing just on the other side of the glass. I lay completely still, eyes squeezed shut, praying it wouldn't break the window. After what seemed like forever, the footsteps moved away. But before they disappeared entirely, I heard something new, a sound that still haunts me. A low, rumbling vocalization, not quite a growl, not quite speech. Something between the two that raised the hair on my arms and made Cooper whimper. The next day, I found large handprints on several of my windows. The same elongated fingers, the same unusual thumb position. And around the entire perimeter of my house was a line of broken twigs and bent grass, as if something very large had methodically walked the boundary of my property. This has continued for months now, not every night, but often enough that I've developed a strange routine around it. I leave my lights off at night now. I've found that drawing attention only seems to increase the activity. On nights when the motion sensor triggers, I stay in bed, avoid looking out windows, and just let whatever it is do its observing undisturbed. Cooper has gradually become less fearful. He still won't go into the backyard at night, but he no longer hides when the lights go on. It's almost as if he's accepted our visitor as part of our life now. The cameras still malfunction regularly, though occasionally they'll capture something, a shadow moving unnaturally fast, a glimpse of what might be a large, hair-covered limb. Never enough to convince anyone who hasn't experienced it firsthand. I've found more offerings on my porch, always small game animals, always killed cleanly and placed carefully. I've started leaving things in return, apples, berries, occasionally a loaf of bread. These items always disappear by morning. Am I afraid? Yes, absolutely. But I've also developed a strange sort of acceptance, whatever this Sasquatch is, and yes, I do believe that's what I'm dealing with. It hasn't tried to harm me. It seems curious, perhaps even protective in some bizarre way. It watches my house, walks my property line, leaves me gifts. Last week, I got home later than usual from work. It was already dark, and as I pulled into my driveway, my headlights caught something at the edge of the woods, those now familiar amber eyes, watching. But instead of retreating into the trees, the figure took a single step forward, just enough for me to see its massive silhouette against the night sky. It raised one long arm, not in threat but almost like a greeting. Then it was gone. I still don't understand what's happening or why this creature has focused on my property. Some nights I lie awake wondering if it was here all along, watching for years before I finally noticed it. Other times, I wonder what changed last August that made it start approaching my house, studying me through windows, leaving me gifts. All I know is that something is out there in the woods behind my house. Something intelligent, curious, and powerful, something that knows I'm aware of it now. And I can't shake the feeling that this is only the beginning of whatever strange relationship is developing between us. The motion light's just triggered. It's 2:15 in the morning. Cooper is sitting by the window, ears perked up but calm. I'm not going to look outside this time. Some things, once seen, can't be unseen. And some visitors, once acknowledged, never truly leave. Story 10. I've never been a superstitious person. I've always been the guy who laughs at ghost stories around the campfire and rolls his eyes when someone swears they saw something in the woods. That changed last July. I still get this weird feeling in the pit of my stomach when I think about what happened. I've typed this out and deleted it at least 5 times now, but I need to get it off my chest. It was July 2014, and I was night fishing at a small boat dock in Winona, Missouri. I'm an avid fisherman, been doing it since I was a kid. My dad taught me everything I know about fishing, and it's always been my way of clearing my head when life gets too noisy. That night, I went to this secluded spot at the end of a dead-end road near a wildlife refuge. I liked it because hardly anyone knew about it, and I could fish in peace without tourists or weekend warriors scaring away all the fish. The dock itself wasn't anything special, just a wooden platform extending about 15 feet into the water, weathered grey boards with gaps between them where you could see the black water below. I'd been there dozens of times, usually during the day, but summer in Missouri is no joke. The daytime was sweltering and the mosquitoes were relentless. Night fishing seemed like the smarter option, even though the fish weren't always as active. I arrived just after sunset, around 8:30. The sky still had that deep blue glow before it turns completely black. I backed my truck up close to the trailhead, just a worn dirt path through about 30 yards of brush that led to the dock. I remember thinking how peaceful it was. No highway sounds, no people, just the gentle lap of water against the shore and the occasional chirp of a cricket. I lugged my tackle box, chair and cooler down to the dock, got everything set up, and cast my first line. The water was dead still that night, like glass, not a breath of wind. You could see the stars reflecting perfectly on the surface. I had a small LED lantern, but I kept it dim so it wouldn't attract too many bugs or scare off the fish, just bright enough to see what I was doing. For the first hour or so, nothing much happened. I caught a couple of small bass, nothing worth keeping, so I threw them back. I cracked open a beer from my cooler and just enjoyed the solitude. This is what fishing is really about for me. Not necessarily catching anything impressive, but just being out there with your thoughts, away from everything else. Around 10 o'clock, I noticed a river otter swimming in the shallows to my right, maybe 20 feet from the dock. It was methodically hunting, diving down and coming up with small fish. I've always liked watching otters. There's something playful about them even when they're hunting. This one was pretty focused, moving parallel to the shoreline, creating gentle ripples in the otherwise still water. That's when I first noticed the eyes. At first, I thought I was seeing things. Just two yellowish pinpoints of light blinking in and out in the darkness of the tree line about 40 feet behind where the otter was feeding. I figured it was probably an owl perched on a branch. We have several species of owls in that area, and their eyes can look like that in the darkness. What struck me as odd, though, was that every time I tried to look directly at them, they would vanish. I'd catch them in my peripheral vision, but when I turned my head to get a better look, they'd disappear. Then, when I went back to watching the otter or checking my line, they'd reappear in my side vision. It was like a weird game of hide and seek that went on for at least 45 minutes. I started to get this crawling sensation on the back of my neck. You know that feeling when you're being watched? It was like that, but I kept telling myself I was being stupid. It's just an owl, I thought, nothing to get worked up about. But then I realized something else that bothered me. There were no owl sounds, no hooting, nothing, just silent eyes blinking in and out of the darkness. The otter kept feeding, seemingly unconcerned, which made me think I really was overreacting. If there was anything dangerous nearby, surely the otter would sense it before I would. Then everything changed in an instant. The otter suddenly jerked its head up, went completely still for maybe 2 seconds, then bolted from the water like something had spooked it badly. It scrambled up the bank and disappeared into the underbrush. The speed with which it moved, I've never seen an otter move that fast. It was like it got an electric shock. In the same moment the otter fled, I caught a glimpse of movement in exactly the spot where I'd been seeing those eyes. Something large and grayish moved from behind a bush to a cedar tree. The movement was so quick I couldn't make out any details, but what struck me was the width of whatever it was. This wasn't a deer or a person. The body mass passing between those 2 points was at least 2 feet wide, and it moved silently, completely silently. My heart rate spiked immediately. I sat frozen, fishing rod clutched in my hand, straining my eyes to see better in the darkness. I remember my mouth going completely dry. The silence around me suddenly felt oppressive, like the whole forest was holding its breath, and then, splash! Something hit the water about 5 feet from the dock where I was sitting. Not a small splash like a fish jumping, but a heavy, substantial displacement of water. Whatever made that splash was big, way too big to be a fish or any normal wildlife that would be active at night. I nearly jumped out of my skin. My heart wasn't just racing anymore. It felt like it was trying to punch its way out of my chest. The sound of the splash was still echoing in my ears when this wave of fear hit me. And when I say fear, I don't mean being startled or creeped out. This was something deeper, more primal, like my body knew I was in danger before my mind could process it. People talk about fight or flight, but they rarely mention the third response, freeze. That's what happened to me first. I couldn't move. I just sat there, the fishing rod trembling in my white-knuckled grip, staring at the ripples spreading from where the splash had occurred. The water settled back to stillness within seconds, but it felt like an hour. When I could finally move, I didn't waste any time. I didn't reel in my line properly. I just yanked the rod, breaking the line, and scrambled to my feet. I grabbed my tackle box and cooler, leaving the chair behind. I didn't run. Somehow that felt more dangerous, like it would trigger a chase response. But I walked as fast as I possibly could back up that dirt path to my truck. The walk from the dock to my truck was only 30 yards, but it was the longest 30 yards of my life. I could feel it behind me. I didn't hear footsteps, didn't hear breathing, didn't hear branches breaking. But I knew something was there. I knew it was watching me leave, The feeling of eyes boring into my back was almost physical, like pressure between my shoulder blades. When I reached my truck, I threw everything in the bed, not even bothering to organize it. I fumbled with my keys for what felt like forever, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I remember the dome light being on and feeling completely exposed, like I was on a stage with a spotlight on me and something watching from the darkness. The truck started on the first try, thank God. I reversed hard, spun the wheel, and got the hell out of there, kicking up dust and gravel. I didn't even think about my fishing chair until I was 5 miles down the road. The rational part of my brain started kicking in as I drove, trying to make sense of what had happened. Could it have been a bear? We do have black bears in Missouri, but they're not common in that area. A person playing a prank. But who would know I'd be there? And how could anyone move that silently or be that massive? A deer? But deer don't have yellow eyes that blink in and out like that, and they certainly don't throw rocks or logs into water. I couldn't shake the image of that grey mass moving between the bush and the cedar tree. It was so fast, but substantial, thick and tall. I didn't get a good look at it, but thinking back, whatever moved was taller than the bush, which must have been at least 7 feet. The splash is what really gets me. That wasn't an animal jumping in for a swim. It felt deliberate, like whatever was watching me wanted me to know it was there, like it was saying, I could reach you if I wanted to. I got home around midnight, still shaking. My wife was already asleep, and I didn't wake her. What would I say? Hey, honey, I think a Bigfoot was stalking me tonight. I would have sounded insane. I took a hot shower and tried to calm down, but I didn't sleep at all that night. I just kept seeing those yellow eyes, blinking in and out of existence. I went back the next day to get my chair, broad daylight, with a buddy who thought I was overreacting about losing my chair. I didn't tell him the real story. We found the chair right where I'd left it. Nothing looked disturbed, no footprints, no signs of anything unusual. My friend laughed at me for being so forgetful, but I know what I saw. Those eyes, the massive shape moving with impossible silence, the otter's panic and that deliberate splash. They weren't my imagination. I've been back to that spot a few times since then, but only during the day and never alone. I can't bring myself to night fish there anymore. Every time I'm there, I find myself scanning the tree line, looking for those eyes. What haunts me most is the certainty I felt in that moment, the absolute knowledge that I was being watched by something that didn't want to be seen, something that could have reached me in seconds if it had wanted to, something intelligent enough to stay hidden, but bold enough to let me know it was there. I've read about Sasquatch encounters since then. I never used to pay attention to that stuff, thought it was all hoaxes and people seeing bears. Now I'm not so sure. The yellow eyes, the massive size, the deliberate intimidation, it all fits with what other people have reported. I don't tell this story to many people. Most would think I'm exaggerating or making it up. But I know what I experienced that night in Winona. There are things in the woods that most people never see. Things that stay hidden, except when they choose not to be. And sometimes, for reasons I can't understand, they choose to let you know they're watching. Every time I go fishing now, even at completely different locations, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being observed. I find myself constantly scanning the tree line, looking for those yellow eyes. And I never, ever stay out after dark anymore. Story 11. I've been a hunter all my life. Growing up in western North Carolina, heading into the woods was just what we did. My dad taught me to track deer when I was 8, and I got my first buck at 12. I've spent countless hours in the forests around Franklin, and I know those mountains like the back of my hand. Or at least I thought I did. What happened on December 1st, 2012, changed everything I thought I knew about these woods. I've kept this story mostly to myself for years. Who would believe it? I'm not some attention seeker or conspiracy nut. I'm just a regular guy who experienced something I still can't explain. I'm only sharing this now because I need to tell someone who won't immediately think I'm crazy or lying. That Saturday morning started like any other hunting day. My alarm went off at 3:30 a.m. and I crawled out of bed while my wife Elaine was still sleeping. I had my coffee, grabbed my gear, and was out the door by 4. The plan was to be at my spot well before sunrise to set up for deer. December's a prime time for hunting around here. The rut is usually still going, and the weather is cool enough that the deer move during daylight hours. I drove about 45 minutes from our house to a remote area I'd been hunting for years. It's off an unmarked Forest Service road that winds up into the mountains. Not many people know about this spot, which is why I like it. You have to follow this winding dirt road for a good 4 miles before reaching a small clearing where I usually park. It was pitch black when I arrived, around 4:30. The temperature was probably in the mid-30s, and there was this strange stillness in the air. No wind at all. I remember thinking it was almost too quiet. Usually you hear something, even if it's just an occasional owl. But that morning, nothing. I backed my truck up to the edge of the trees and started unloading my gear. I had just grabbed my rifle from the back seat when I heard it. Knock. A single, loud, deliberate knock that echoed through the darkness. It wasn't random or natural. It sounded intentional, like someone had taken a solid branch and struck it hard against a tree trunk. The sound came from maybe 100 yards into the forest to my right. I froze instantly. In all my years hunting these woods, I'd never heard anything quite like that. My first thought was another hunter, but that made no sense. Why would anyone knock a stick against a tree at 4:30 in the morning? And I hadn't seen any other vehicles on the road in. I stood there for a good minute, listening. Nothing followed. No movement, no additional sounds, just that heavy silence again. I'll admit it spooked me a bit, but I chalked it up to maybe a dead branch falling, or some other explanation that my brain couldn't process in the dark. I had deer to hunt, so I grabbed the rest of my gear and headed into the woods toward my tree stand. The hunt that morning was completely uneventful. I didn't see a single deer, which was unusual for that spot. Typically, I'd at least see a doe or two passing through, even if no bucks showed up, but that day, nothing. Even more strange was the lack of other wildlife. No squirrels, no birds, no turkeys. It was as if the woods were empty. By noon, I decided to pack it in. As I was walking back to my truck, that knock kept replaying in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the whole morning. When I got home, I told Elaine about it. She's always been interested in the outdoors, though she doesn't hunt herself. When I mentioned the weird knock and the unusual silence in the woods, she suggested we go back that afternoon to check it out. Not to hunt, just to walk around and see if we could figure out what might have caused it. Maybe look for deer sign too, since I hadn't seen any that morning. I agreed, thinking it would be good to scout the area anyway. We had lunch, and around 2 p.m. we drove back out to the same spot. It was a clear December afternoon, probably in the mid-40s by then. The sun was bright, but in December it sits low in the sky, and the light filters through the trees at an angle that creates these pockets of shadow even in the middle of the day. We parked in the same clearing, and I showed Elaine where I thought the knock had come from that morning. There's an old logging road, more of a wide trail now, that runs down the mountain from where I park. It's overgrown in places but still walkable. We decided to follow it down to see if we could spot anything unusual. The forest there is thick, mainly oak and hickory with some pine mixed in, and lots of rhododendron undergrowth that forms these dense thickets. The logging road cuts through all this, winding down the slope of the mountain. We'd been walking maybe 15 minutes, talking quietly about nothing important, when I had this sudden feeling of being watched. You know that sensation on the back of your neck. It was like that, but stronger. I slowed down, and Elaine noticed right away that something was wrong. "What is it?" she whispered. I didn't answer immediately. I was scanning the woods around us, trying to figure out what had triggered that feeling. That's when I glanced up to my left, toward a ridge that ran parallel to the logging road. I still remember how my body reacted before my mind could even process what I was seeing. My heart started hammering against my ribs, and I felt this cold wave wash over me from head to toe. About 200 yards up the slope, partially hidden behind a large oak tree, was a figure. It was standing upright, completely motionless. At first, my brain tried to categorize it as person, but immediately I knew that wasn't right. It was too big, too different. I reached out and grabbed Elaine's arm, probably harder than I meant to. I didn't say anything, just nodded in that direction. Her eyes followed mine, and I heard her sharp intake of breath when she spotted it too. The figure was standing so still, it almost seemed part of the forest. But it wasn't. I could make out the outline of broad shoulders, too wide for a human. It was tall, really tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet at least. Most of its body was hidden behind the tree, but what I could see wasn't covered in clothes. It looked like dark hair or fur. But it was the way it was standing that really got to me. It wasn't random, like an animal that happened to be upright for a moment. It was deliberate, watching us. There was intention in that stillness. The air around us changed in that moment. It's hard to explain, but everything seemed to get heavier. The forest went completely silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just this oppressive quiet that pressed in from all sides. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. "Mason," Elaine whispered, her voice barely audible. "What is that?" I couldn't answer. My mouth had gone completely dry. We both stood frozen on the trail, staring at this thing. And it stood equally still, watching us from behind that tree. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Probably only 30 seconds or so, but it felt like hours. I remember thinking I should get my phone out to take a picture, but my body wouldn't respond. It was like my brain was screaming at my limbs to move, but they refused. Then Elaine squeezed my arm and whispered, "It's watching us." That simple statement broke whatever spell had been holding me in place. I managed to look away, down at the ground, trying to gather my thoughts. I looked back up the ridge almost immediately. It was gone, just gone. There had been no sound, no movement that we detected. One moment it was there, and the next it had vanished. Something that size should have made noise moving through the forest, breaking branches, rustling leaves, something. But there was nothing, just that same heavy silence. Where did it go? Elaine's voice was still hushed, but edged with panic now. "I don't know," I said, my own voice sounding strange to my ears. "Let's go back to the truck." We turned and started walking back up the logging road, much faster than we'd come down it. Neither of us ran. Somehow that seemed like it would be worse, like running would trigger something. But we moved quickly, and I kept looking over my shoulder every few steps. The feeling of being watched didn't diminish as we retreated. If anything, it intensified. The hair on my arms and the back of my neck was standing up, and every sound in the forest seemed amplified. A chickadee called somewhere to our right, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. "What was that thing, Mason?" Elaine asked as we hurried along. "A bear?" "No," I said immediately. "Not a bear." I'd seen plenty of bears in these woods over the years. This wasn't that. Bears don't stand behind trees and watch you with that kind of awareness. Then what? I didn't answer right away. The word that had popped into my head seemed absurd, even though it was the only thing that fit what we'd seen. "I think," I finally said, keeping my voice low, "it might have been a Sasquatch." Saying it out loud should have made it sound ridiculous. Instead, it sent another chill through me because I knew somehow that I was right. Elaine didn't laugh or tell me I was crazy. She just nodded, her face pale. "The way it was standing," she said. The size of it, yeah. We reached the truck without incident, but the relief I expected to feel didn't come. Even inside the vehicle with the doors locked, that sense of being observed remained. I started the engine and backed out of the clearing faster than was probably safe on that rough road. As we drove down the mountain, Elaine kept looking out her window back toward the woods. "Do you think it followed us?" she asked. "I don't know," I answered truthfully. "Maybe." We were both quiet for most of the drive home. What was there to say? We'd seen something that shouldn't exist, something that upended everything I thought I knew about these mountains I'd spent my life exploring. When we got home, we tried to talk through what we'd experienced, to make sense of it. The figure had been massive, not just tall, but broad. The brief glimpse I'd gotten of its arm showed muscle definition, unlike anything I'd seen on a bear or other animal. And the intelligence in the way it had positioned itself, hidden yet watching, sent another wave of goosebumps across my skin as I recalled it. "That knock you heard this morning," Elaine said suddenly. "You don't think—" I hadn't connected the two events until she mentioned it, but immediately I knew she was right. That deliberate tree knock had been a signal or communication of some kind. And whatever had made that sound had also been watching me in the darkness as I unloaded my truck at 4:30 in the morning. The thought made me feel exposed, vulnerable in a way I'd never experienced in the woods before. These forests had always been my second home. Now they held something unknown, something that turned the familiar into something alien. That night, neither of us slept well. I kept replaying the scene in my mind. That motionless figure, the way it disappeared without a sound, the oppressive feeling that had descended over the forest. It didn't feel threatening exactly, but it didn't feel friendly either. It felt other, like we'd glimpsed something that existed alongside our world, but separate from it. I haven't been back to that specific spot since that day. I still hunt other areas, but something in me can't face returning to that particular section of forest. Elaine says she sometimes dreams about it. Not nightmares exactly, but dreams where she's walking in the woods and feels that same heaviness in the air, that same sense of being observed. Sometimes when I'm in the forest now, I find myself looking over my shoulder more often, listening more carefully, wondering if that knock might come again. I've researched Sasquatch encounters since then and found reports of similar experiences. The tree knocks, the way they can seemingly vanish without a trace, the heavy atmosphere that accompanies sightings. I don't expect everyone to believe this story. Hell, if someone had told me this before it happened, I probably wouldn't have believed them either. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I know that the forests around Franklin hold secrets that most people will never glimpse. Whatever was watching us that December afternoon, it changed something fundamental in how I view the world. There are things out there we don't understand, things that defy explanation, things that can stand perfectly still behind a tree, watching you with an intelligence that feels ancient and unknowable before disappearing as if they were never there at all. Story 12. I've debated for months whether to share this. Some of you will think I'm crazy or making this up, but I swear on everything I care about that what I'm about to tell you happened exactly as I'm writing it. I've always been a skeptic about Bigfoot and all that, but after what happened to me while hiking near Forks, Washington, back in October 2001, I don't know what to believe anymore. I'm an experienced hiker, been doing solo trips through the Olympic Peninsula for years. That day started like any other fall hike. The weather forecast mentioned possible fog later in the day, but nothing severe enough to cancel my plans. I'd packed light, just water, some trail mix, a map, compass, and basic emergency gear. I remember feeling good that morning. Even took a picture of the sunrise from my car at the trailhead before heading out. The first few hours were perfect. Crisp autumn air, leaves changing color, that earthy smell of damp soil and pine. I'd planned a 7-mile loop on some ridge trails that I'd done before. Nothing too challenging. The trail climbs gradually for the first 3 miles through old-growth forest before opening up to some really stunning views of the valleys. Or at least, that's what should have happened. Around 11 in the morning, I noticed wisps of fog starting to roll in. Not unusual for that time of year, and honestly, I kind of enjoy hiking in light fog. There's something peaceful about it. But this fog came in fast. Within maybe 20 minutes, it went from those wisps to a thick, soupy blanket that cut visibility down to just a few feet in front of me. I'm not exaggerating when I say I couldn't see more than 10 feet ahead on the trail. I wasn't immediately concerned. I had my compass and knew the general direction I needed to go. The trail was well marked with those blue blazes on the trees, so I figured I'd just take it slow and be fine. That's when I first noticed how quiet everything had gotten. If you hike regularly, you know the forest is never truly silent. There's always something. Birds, squirrels, the rustle of leaves, distant streams. But in that fog, everything sounded muffled, like someone had thrown a heavy blanket over the whole forest. My footsteps on the pine needles seemed unnaturally loud. I remember stopping and just listening for a minute, trying to get my bearings through sound since my sight was so limited. That's when I heard it for the first time. 2 distinct knocks, like someone hitting a piece of wood against a tree trunk. Knock, knock. Not together, but spaced about a second apart. It came from somewhere off to my right, maybe 50 yards away, but it was hard to tell with the fog distorting sounds. "Hello?" I called out, thinking maybe it was another hiker signaling. No response. I started walking again, a bit faster now. About 5 minutes later, those 2 knocks came again, but this time from behind me. I stopped and turned around. "Hey, is someone there?" Nothing but silence. I pulled out my map and compass, trying to orient myself. The trail should have been turning west at that point, leading up to the ridge viewpoint, but as I studied the terrain around me, nothing looked familiar. The trees were different, older and more massive than I remembered from previous hikes on this trail. That's when I realized I must have wandered off the main path without noticing. No problem, I thought. I'll just backtrack until I find the trail markers again. I turned around and started walking in the direction I'd come from. After about 15 minutes of careful hiking, I still hadn't found any trail markers. The fog had somehow gotten even thicker, if that was possible. I heard the knocks again, 2 distinct sounds, but now they were coming from my left. I froze. Something about those knocks didn't seem random. They were deliberate, consistent in their timing and volume. I changed direction, moving perpendicular to where I thought the knocks were coming from. Within minutes, the knocks sounded again, but now they were in front of me. Whatever was making that sound had moved, keeping pace with me through the fog. My heart started beating faster. I'm not easily spooked in the woods. I've encountered bears, mountain lions at a distance, all kinds of wildlife. But something about this situation felt different, wrong somehow. Then I heard something new, a low, deep grunt. Not like a bear, which I've heard before. This was deeper, more resonant, almost like a very deep human voice clearing its throat, but without any human quality to it. It was a steady, rhythmic sound, grunt, 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 almost like heavy breathing, but deliberate. I stopped again and the grunting stopped too. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sounds. I felt watched. You know that prickly feeling on the back of your neck when someone's staring at you? It was like that, but amplified by 10. "I don't mean any harm," I called out, feeling stupid even as I said it. "I'm just trying to find my way back to the trail." Nothing. I decided my best bet was to keep moving downhill. Most trails in that area follow valleys and waterways, so heading downhill would eventually lead me to something recognizable. I started walking again, carefully picking my way through the fog. The knocking sounds followed me, always keeping their distance but shifting position as I changed direction. Sometimes they'd stop for 10 or 15 minutes, then start up again, just when I'd begun to relax. The grunting sounds came and went too. After what felt like hours, my watch said it had been about 45 minutes, I stepped into a small clearing where the ground sloped downward. I paused to catch my breath and take a drink from my water bottle. My hands were shaking, though I wasn't sure if it was from exhaustion, cold, or fear, probably all three. As I stood there, I had the sudden, overwhelming sensation that I wasn't alone. I looked up, peering through the fog that swirled around me. That's when I saw it. About 30 yards uphill from me, partially obscured by the fog but unmistakably there, stood a figure between two massive pine trees. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it as something familiar. A bear standing on its hind legs maybe, or another hiker wearing a bulky backpack. But it was neither of those things. It was tall, at least 7 feet, maybe 8, and completely motionless. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, easily twice the width of a large man. What struck me most was how still it was. No swaying, no shifting of weight like you'd see with a person or animal trying to maintain balance. It was planted there, watching me. The fog made details difficult to make out, but I could see its silhouette clearly enough, the conical-shaped head that seemed to blend right into the massive shoulders, the long arms that hung down almost to its knees. It was dark, either covered in dark hair or fur that absorbed the little light filtering through the fog. I stood completely still, afraid to make any sudden movements. My mind raced through my options. Should I run? Call out to it, try to appear threatening? In the end, I did nothing but stand there, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The creature didn't approach. It didn't make any aggressive moves. It just watched. I don't know how long we stood there like that, probably less than a minute, but it felt like hours. Then, without any rush or apparent concern, it simply took one step backward and disappeared into the fog. I remained frozen for several more minutes, straining to hear or see any sign of it. Nothing. Finally, the knocking sounds resumed, but they were farther away now, moving off into the distance. I'm not ashamed to admit I was terrified. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but I knew that running blindly through foggy, unfamiliar forest was a recipe for disaster. Instead, I took a deep breath, oriented myself downhill again, and started walking as quickly as I could while still being careful of my footing. I didn't hear the knocking sounds again. The forest remained eerily quiet as I made my way downward, constantly looking over my shoulder and scanning the fog around me. After about an hour of steady hiking, I started to notice the fog thinning slightly. I could see maybe 20 feet ahead instead of just 10. When I finally stumbled onto a marked trail, the relief was overwhelming. I recognized it as one of the main routes through the park, though it was miles away from where I thought I'd been. According to my map, I had somehow traveled nearly 3 miles off my intended course, which seemed impossible given the time that had passed. The fog continued to lift as I made my way back toward the parking area. By the time I reached my car, nearly 2 hours later, it was mostly clear, with just patches of mist hanging in the lower areas. My 7-mile planned hike had turned into a 12-mile ordeal, and I was exhausted, my legs shaking from exertion and leftover adrenaline. As I drove home, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Could it have been another hiker? A bear? Some trick of the fog and my fear-addled brain? But I couldn't reconcile any of those explanations with what I'd witnessed. The deliberate knocking sounds that followed me, the deep grunts, and most of all, that tall, still figure watching me from the trees. A few weeks later, when the weather improved, I went back to try and retrace my steps. I wanted to understand how I'd gotten so far off trail and maybe find some evidence of what I'd seen. I spent the whole day searching the area where I thought the encounter had happened, but found nothing unusual. No strange footprints, no broken branches, nothing that couldn't be explained by normal wildlife. It's been years now, and I still don't know what to make of what happened that day. I've read about other people's Sasquatch encounters, and many elements match what I experienced. The knocking sounds, the vocalizations, the quiet observation. But I never saw a detailed face, never had any aggressive interaction. It just watched me. One thing I know for certain, I don't hike alone in foggy conditions anymore. I've been back to those mountains many times since then, but always with companions, always in good weather. Some nights when I can't sleep, I still see that silhouette in my mind, broad shoulders, conical head, impossibly still, watching me through the mist. And I wonder if it's still out there, moving silently through the forests of Forks, occasionally letting out those knocks to communicate with others of its kind. I don't expect anyone to believe me completely. I'm not sure I would believe it if someone else told me this story, but I know what I experienced, and it fundamentally changed how I view the wilderness. There are things in those ancient forests that we don't understand, things that have managed to stay hidden despite our endless exploration and documentation of the natural world. Sometimes when I'm hiking and hear unexpected knocking in the distance, even if it's just a woodpecker or a falling branch, I freeze for a moment, listening for that follow-up knock that never comes. And part of me is relieved, while another part wonders if I'll ever get answers about what really happened to me in the fog that day. Story 13. I've debated for years whether I should share this. Part of me thinks people will just call me a liar or say I was hallucinating. But I know what I saw, and I can't keep it bottled up anymore. This happened in September 2011, and I still think about it almost every day. For background, I've spent most of my life in the outdoors. I grew up in western Montana, and my dad had me fishing before I could properly tie my own shoes. By the time I was a teenager, I was spending weeks at a time backpacking, hunting, and fishing solo in remote wilderness. I've encountered just about every animal native to the northern Rockies: black bears, grizzlies, mountain lions, wolves, you name it. I know their behaviors, their sounds, their movements. I'm not someone who spooks easily in the woods. In September 2011, I planned a 3-day fishing trip to a remote creek system outside Libby, Montana. This area is seriously remote. We're talking hundreds of square miles of dense forest with almost no roads or trails. Most locals don't even bother going that deep because it's such rough country, but I'd heard rumors about the incredible cutthroat trout in these headwaters, so I was determined to check it out. I parked my truck at an old logging road access point early that morning and hiked about 7 miles in. The terrain was brutal, steep hillsides covered in thick underbrush and fallen timber. By mid-afternoon, I'd reached the creek I was targeting. It was perfect. Crystal clear water running through a small valley with steep forested hillsides rising on both banks. I set up a small camp about 50 yards back from the water's edge. Nothing fancy, just my one-person tent, a small fire ring I built and my gear. After resting for a bit, I decided to scout the creek before doing any serious fishing. I followed it downstream for about a mile, marking good fishing spots in my mind for later. Something felt off that entire afternoon, though I couldn't put my finger on why. The forest was quieter than it should have been. I've spent enough time in the mountains to know when something isn't right. Usually, you'll hear birds, squirrels, the occasional larger animal moving through brush. But that day, everything felt muted. At the time, I chalked it up to an incoming storm system. Animals often go quiet before bad weather. I returned to camp around 7 in the evening, cooked a simple meal of freeze-dried pasta, and decided I'd do some night fishing. September in Montana means the days are getting shorter, and it was nearly dark by 8:30. I grabbed my rod, tackle box, headlamp, and, importantly, my high-powered spotlight. I always carry a serious spotlight when night fishing in bear country. It's a heavy-duty, rechargeable model that can illuminate objects clearly at 200 yards. The fishing spot I chose was a deep pool about a quarter-mile upstream from my camp. The creek widened there to maybe 25 feet across, with my side having a small rocky beach area while the opposite bank rose steeply into dense forest. I started casting around 9, with just my headlamp on to preserve my night vision. The fishing was decent. I'd caught and released 3 nice cutthroats in about an hour. It was around 10:15 when everything changed. I first heard what sounded like a heavy branch breaking on the hillside across the creek. Not unusual in itself, could be an elk or deer moving through. But then came another crack, louder this time, followed by what I can only describe as a deep, guttural growl. Not a bear growl, I've heard plenty of those. This was different, deeper, more resonant, and frankly, more human-like in its tone. It sent a chill straight down my spine. I immediately turned off my headlamp and crouched down, staying completely still. My first thought was grizzly, but the sound wasn't right. Mountain lion was my second guess. But again, the vocalization didn't match any cat I'd ever heard. What happened next convinced me this wasn't any normal wildlife encounter. The sounds started moving laterally across the hillside, about 100 yards up from the creek. Whatever it was, moved about 60 yards to my left, then stopped. There was more breaking of branches, another deep growl, and then, I'm not exaggerating, what sounded like a deliberate slapping or pounding on a tree trunk. Then it moved back to the right, past its original position, and continued another 60 yards or so in that direction. More breaking branches, more growls, and now a sound I can only describe as a cross between a howl and a whoop. It was systematic, almost like it was patrolling the hillside. This pattern continued for nearly 30 minutes. Left, right, left again, each time making these incredible vocalizations and breaking timber. Sometimes I'd hear entire trees, not branches, but small trees being snapped. The sounds were gradually moving downhill toward the creek, toward me. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Every instinct told me to run, but I knew better. Whatever was out there, running would be the worst thing I could do. If it was a predator, movement would trigger a chase response, so I stayed frozen, barely breathing, trying to process what I was hearing. When the sounds reached the tree line directly across the creek from me, maybe 50 yards away now, I heard something that made my blood run cold. 2 distinct sets of footsteps, bipedal footsteps, moving through the undergrowth. Not the 4-beat rhythm of a bear or deer, but the unmistakable dual cadence of something walking on 2 legs. I'm a hunter. I know what humans sound like walking through forest. These were heavier, more powerful steps than any human I've ever heard, but the pattern was unmistakably bipedal, and there were definitely 2 separate individuals. At this point, I had to know what I was dealing with. My hand was shaking as I reached for my spotlight. I took a deep breath, stood up slowly and flicked it on, aiming directly at where the sounds were coming from. What I saw in that beam of light will stay with me until my dying day. Standing at the edge of the forest, partially obscured by the last line of trees, but clearly visible, were 2 massive, upright figures. They were standing side by side, facing perpendicular to me so I could see their profiles. Each one stood at least 7 feet tall, the taller one possibly 7.5 feet. They were covered in dark, shaggy hair, not fur like a bear, but hair that hung from their bodies. Their build is what struck me the most. These weren't bulky, round creatures like bears standing up. They had broad, massive shoulders tapering to narrower waists, with clearly defined buttocks and long, powerful arms that hung lower than a human's would. The muscle definition was visible even beneath the hair. These things were incredibly powerful looking, but lean, like Olympic athletes. Not an ounce of fat on them. I could see the muscles in their thighs and calves flex as they shifted their weight. Their hands were large, proportionally much bigger than human hands. I couldn't make out facial features clearly, since they weren't facing me, but I could see the profiles of what appeared to be flattened, broad noses and heavy brow ridges. The moment my light hit them, they didn't look toward it like most animals would. Instead, as if coordinated, both creatures immediately turned and sprinted uphill into the forest. The way they moved was incredible. Powerful, fluid strides covering ground faster than any human could, especially on that steep terrain. They didn't crash blindly through the forest either. They navigated between trees and over fallen logs with extraordinary agility. I kept my light trained on them until they disappeared into the timber, but I could hear them running for at least another 30 seconds after they were out of sight, breaking branches and displacing rocks as they raced uphill. When the forest finally fell silent, I realized I'd been holding my breath. My hands were shaking so badly, I nearly dropped the spotlight. I quickly gathered my fishing gear, not caring if I left anything behind, and booked it back toward my camp. I'm not ashamed to admit I ran most of the way. Back at camp, I didn't sleep a wink. I kept my fire blazing all night, spotlight at the ready, and my bear spray and hunting knife within reach. I heard no more unusual sounds, but every normal forest noise had me jumping. At first light, I packed up and hiked out, moving as fast as I safely could through that rough country. It took me 5 hours to reach my truck, and I kept looking over my shoulder the entire way. For weeks afterward, I told myself it must have been bears, two grizzlies standing near each other, playing some trick on my eyes in the spotlight. But I know bears. I've encountered dozens throughout my life. These weren't bears. The proportions were wrong, the movement was wrong, the sounds were wrong. I've spent hundreds of hours researching since then, reading accounts, watching documentaries, even attending a couple of conferences where people shared similar experiences. I've never been particularly interested in cryptozoology before, but now I can't stop thinking about it. What I saw that night were Sasquatches. 2 of them. I'm as certain of that as I am of anything I've ever experienced. The systematic way they moved across that hillside suggests intelligence and communication. The fact that they didn't look at the light implies familiarity with humans and our tools. The speed and agility they displayed while escaping uphill through thick forest in the dark was simply not possible for a human. I've only told a few close friends about this experience. Most gave me the reaction I expected: nervous laughter, concerned looks, gentle suggestions that maybe I was tired or my eyes were playing tricks. One friend asked if I'd been drinking. I hadn't. I never drink when I'm in the backcountry. But a couple of people, those who've spent their lives in the deep wilderness of the northern Rockies, just nodded quietly. One older hunting guide simply said, "You're not the first to see them in those parts. I've never gone back to that specific creek, not because I'm afraid exactly, but out of respect. That place belongs to them, not to me." I still fish and hunt all over western Montana, but something changed in me that night. I'm more observant now, more aware that the wilderness holds secrets we've barely begun to understand. I don't expect everyone to believe me. Hell, if someone had told me this story before 2011, I probably wouldn't have believed them either. But I know what I saw. Those weren't bears, weren't elk, weren't any recognized animal. They were Sasquatches, living quietly in one of the last truly wild places in the lower 48. Sometimes I wonder if they remember me, the human who caught them with his light beam for those few incredible seconds. I wonder if they've seen other humans before, or if I was as strange to them as they were to me. I don't have answers, just the memory of that moment when everything I thought I knew about our forests changed forever. Story 14. I don't talk about this much. Even 44 years later, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. My cousin Megan and I were just 12 years old when it happened back in September of 1979. It was a warm afternoon in Corvallis, the kind where the air feels sticky, but there's still that hint of fall coming. We were bored, like most kids get in late summer, and decided to go for a walk on the trails behind our neighborhood. These weren't some remote wilderness trails or anything. They were just the woods that everyone in the neighborhood used. Kids rode bikes there all the time. We'd played there for years, every summer since I could remember. My parents never worried about us going there because it was basically our extended backyard. It was the kind of place where you'd sometimes run into neighbors walking their dogs or other kids building forts. That's what makes what happened so much weirder. Megan was staying with us that week while her parents were out of town. She lived in Portland normally, so she didn't know the trails as well as I did, but she'd visited enough times. We were close, more like sisters than cousins, the kind who spent hours making up games and sharing secrets. That day, we packed a couple of Cokes and some Twinkies in my backpack, and I remember feeling so grown up because Mom let us go without my annoying little brother tagging along. It was maybe 2 o'clock when we headed out. The sun was still high, filtering through the trees and making those dappled patterns on the ground. I remember the crunch of pine needles under our sneakers and how we kept stopping to pick blackberries from the bushes along the path. We weren't even that far in, maybe 60 yards from the entrance, just past that big curved part where the trail starts to narrow. You know how the hill rises up on the left side there? That slight slope with all those skinny pine trees, that's where I saw it. I wasn't even looking for anything. I just happened to glance up toward the hillside. And that's when I froze. Every hair on my body stood up, and I felt this weird chill wash over me despite the warm day. There was something, someone, standing perfectly still among the pine trees on the slope. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. Was it a hiker? A homeless person, maybe? But it was too big, too different. It was tall, so tall. I'm not exaggerating when I say it had to be at least 7 feet high, probably more, and it was just standing there, completely motionless, watching us. Not hiding, not crouching, just standing upright like a person would. Its body was covered in this medium brown hair, not super dark, but not light either. Sort of a muddy cinnamon color that almost blended with the pine tree trunks behind it. The hair wasn't super shaggy like you see in those blurry photos people share online. It was more, I don't know how to describe it, more like a coat. Not matted, but not fluffy either. What I remember most vividly were its arms. They hung down really low, way past where human arms would end. And its hands, God, its hands, they were huge but unmistakably hand-like. I could clearly see the fingers and palms. They were broader than human hands but had the same basic structure, thumb, fingers, everything. The palms looked lighter in color, almost pinkish compared to the hair-covered parts. Its face is harder to describe. It wasn't completely covered in hair like the rest of it. Around the eyes and nose, the hair was thinner, and I could make out features that seemed almost human-like, but not quite. The face wasn't pushed out like an ape's, but it wasn't exactly human either. The brow was heavy, and the eyes, I couldn't tell their color from that distance, but they were clearly fixed on us. The weirdest part was how still it was. It didn't make any noise. It didn't growl or grunt or anything like that. It just stood there, watching, like it was studying us. Like it was as curious about us as we were shocked by it. In that moment, and I swear this only lasted maybe 10 seconds, I felt this overwhelming feeling that I was seeing something I wasn't supposed to see. Like I had accidentally stepped through some invisible boundary and glimpsed something that existed alongside us, but separate from our world. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. I just stared back at it and it stared at me. It's going to sound crazy, but I felt like it was thinking. There was intelligence in that gaze. Not animal intelligence, something else. Then Megan bumped into me because she'd been looking down at the trail. "What's wrong?" she asked, and I couldn't even speak. I just grabbed her arm and pointed. She saw it too. I know she did, because she made this little gasping sound, and her fingernails dug into my arm. "Oh my God," she whispered. "What is that?" That broke the spell. I yanked on her arm and yelled, "Run!" And we did. We turned and ran faster than I've ever run in my life. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if it was following us. All I could think was that we needed to get out of those woods. We sprinted all the way to the road, not stopping until we hit the pavement. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly. We both bent over, hands on our knees, trying to catch our breath. Cars were passing by on the street. People were mowing lawns. Everything was normal, but nothing felt normal anymore. "Did you see it?" I gasped. Megan nodded, her face pale. "What was it? A bear?" But she knew it wasn't a bear. We both did. It was standing, on two legs, like a person, I said. "It had hands," she whispered. "I saw its hands." We just stood there on the sidewalk, looking back at the trail entrance. It looked so ordinary, so safe in the daylight. But I knew what we'd seen in there. The weird thing is, after about 20 minutes of sitting on the curb trying to make sense of it, we started to doubt ourselves. Had we really seen something? Was it just a weirdly shaped tree that our imaginations had turned into something else? The more we talked about it, the more we convinced ourselves that we needed to go back and check, just to be sure. I know that sounds insane now. Two kids going back to where they just saw what was probably a Sasquatch. But that's the thing about being 12. You're scared, but you're also stupidly brave sometimes. So we went back. Not all the way, and not without weapons. I picked up a sturdy stick, and Megan found a big rock. We crept down the trail, much slower this time, jumping at every sound. When we got to the spot where we'd been standing before, we stopped and looked up at the hillside. There was nothing there, no creature, no broken branches, nothing that could have been mistaken for a 7-foot hairy being. Just trees and underbrush. We even cautiously climbed partway up the slope, our hearts pounding, to check the area where it had been standing. The ground was covered in pine needles, and I remember looking for footprints, but there weren't any clear marks, just some areas where the needles seemed pressed down. Megan pointed to a broken branch on one of the young pine trees, about 6 feet up. It could have been broken by anything, though. A deer, the wind, who knows? We didn't stay long. The woods felt different now. I kept feeling like we were being watched, even though I couldn't see anything. Every rustle of leaves made us jump. When we got home, we debated whether to tell my parents. In the end, we decided not to. They would either think we were making it up for attention, or they'd freak out and never let us go to the trails again. So we kept it to ourselves, though we spent hours that night whispering about it in my bedroom. For weeks afterward, I had nightmares about those eyes watching me through my bedroom window. I'd wake up convinced something was outside, staring in. My mom thought I was just going through a phase. I started keeping my curtains closed all the time. Megan went back to Portland the next day, but we talked on the phone almost every night after that. We'd analyze every detail of what we saw, trying to convince ourselves it was something explainable. A hiker in a weird coat, someone playing a prank, anything other than what we knew it really was. But here's the thing, over 44 years have passed, and the memory hasn't faded like other childhood experiences. I can still see those hands so clearly, the way the fingers hung down, the lighter palms, the stillness of it, the way it just stood there watching us, like it was as surprised to see us as we were to see it. I've told very few people about this over the years. My husband knows, a couple close friends. Most react with polite skepticism or change the subject. Once, at a dinner party in the 90s, someone brought up Bigfoot sightings, and I got so uncomfortable I had to leave the room. It's not that I'm afraid of being ridiculed. I'm a grown woman now with kids of my own. It's more that I don't want to relive the fear of that moment or try to convince others of something I can barely process myself. Megan and I lost touch in our 20s as our lives took different paths. I moved to California for college and stayed there while she ended up on the East Coast. But about 15 years ago, we reconnected on Facebook. The first time we talked on the phone after all those years, we chatted about our kids and jobs, caught up on family news. And then there was this pause in the conversation, and she said, "Do you ever think about what we saw that day in the woods?" I felt goosebumps just like I had that day. "All the time," I admitted. "Me too," she said. "I still can't explain it. I've tried, but I can't." I asked her what she remembered the most, and she didn't hesitate. The hands. They were so human-like, but bigger. And the way it just stood there watching us, not threatening, just aware. That's what has stuck with me all these years. It wasn't threatening us. It wasn't charging or growling or anything aggressive. It was just there, existing, watching, almost like it was as curious about us as we were terrified of it. Sometimes I wonder if it still roams those woods, or if development has pushed it further into the wilderness. Corvallis has grown a lot since 1979. Those trails are probably surrounded by houses now. When I think about all the times we played in those woods before and after that day, completely oblivious to what might have been watching us, it still gives me chills. I've read about other sightings over the years. Some sound ridiculous, clearly made up for attention. But others sound eerily similar to what we experienced. The stillness, the intelligence in the eyes, the human-like qualities mixed with something definitely not human. I don't know what we saw that day. I can't explain it. All I know is that for a brief moment on an ordinary September afternoon in 1979, two 12-year-old girls came face to face with something that shouldn't exist according to everything we're taught about our world. And 4 decades later, I still look at the woods differently. I still feel eyes on me when I hike. And I still wake up sometimes from dreams of standing on that trail, looking up at the hillside, making eye contact with something that seemed to recognize me as much as I recognized it as something extraordinary. The world is stranger than we know. There are things in the shadows of our everyday lives that most people never glimpse. Megan and I did, just for a moment, and nothing has ever felt quite the same since. Story 15. I've lived in Yazoo City, Mississippi my entire life. Never thought I'd be writing something like this. Hell, I used to laugh at people who claimed they saw strange things in the woods. But what happened to me last October changed everything. I thought I knew about these forests. I've been around my whole life. It was October 28th, 2022. I remember the date clear as day because some things stick with you, no matter how much you wish they wouldn't. The sun was starting to set, creating that golden orange glow across the farmlands as I was driving home from my buddy Rick's place. We'd been fixing up his old John Deere tractor all afternoon. I was tired but completely sober and alert. I don't drink or do any kind of drugs. Never have. My dad was sheriff here for 20 years before he retired, and my uncle still works at the department. That kind of stuff just wasn't allowed in our family. I was taking the back way home, that old county road that cuts through the Davis property and winds past about 2 miles of dense woods before hitting the main highway. It's a route I've driven hundreds of times. I had my windows down, enjoying that crisp fall air. It had been unseasonably warm that day, but the evening was cooling off nicely. The radio was playing some old Merle Haggard song, and I was just tapping my fingers on the steering wheel, thinking about what I needed to get done at the hardware store the next day. The road there is pretty straight for about half a mile before it curves sharply to the right. I was going maybe 40 miles per hour, not in any rush. The woods on either side were already getting dark, but the road itself was still clearly visible in the fading light. That's when it happened. As I approached the bend, something stepped out from the tree line on my left. At first, my brain tried to process it as a person, maybe a hunter or someone walking along the road. But in that split second, I knew this wasn't right. This wasn't a person. The thing moved out onto the road about 50 yards ahead of me, and I instinctively hit the brakes. My truck slowed enough that I didn't have to swerve, but I was still rolling forward as this creature crossed directly in front of me. I'm 6'4". Not a small guy by any means. Whatever this was, it was taller than me, maybe 6'8", possibly even 7 feet. But it wasn't just the height that was shocking. It was the build of this thing. Its shoulders were massive, slumped forward in a way that's hard to describe. Not hunched like someone with bad posture, but a completely different kind of body structure. The arms are what really got me. They were incredibly long, hanging way below its knees. No human has proportions like that. Those arms swung in a way that reminded me of how orangutans move. But this thing was upright the entire time. It wasn't running on all fours at any point. It maintained this bizarre, shuffling gait across the road. The whole body was covered in hair. Not fur exactly, but long, shaggy hair, maybe 4 to 6 inches in length. It hung loose and moved naturally with the creature's motion. In the dying sunlight, the color looked dark brown, or maybe reddish brown. Hard to tell exactly. But it definitely wasn't black. I couldn't make out facial features from where I was, but the head seemed proportionally smaller compared to those massive shoulders. The whole thing took maybe 5 seconds to cross the road, but time felt like it was standing still. It wasn't hurrying, but it covered ground fast with that swinging, fluid motion. My truck had almost come to a complete stop at this point, maybe 15 yards from where it crossed. The thing never looked at me or acknowledged my presence. It just continued into the woods on the other side of the road and disappeared into the trees. I sat there for I don't know how long, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I remember thinking, this isn't possible. I didn't just see that. But I did see it. Clear as day, nothing obstructing my view. I wasn't tired enough to be hallucinating, wasn't on medication, wasn't drinking. This was real. After a few minutes of just sitting there in shock, I finally put the truck back in drive and continued home. My hands were shaking the whole way. I didn't stop at the spot where it crossed. Something deep inside me just wanted to get away from there as fast as possible. When I got home, I didn't tell my wife right away. How do you even start that conversation? Hey, honey, guess what I saw on the way home? A Sasquatch. She'd think I was crazy. Hell, I was starting to think I was crazy. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure stepping onto the road, those unnaturally long arms, that fluid but alien movement. I kept going over the details, trying to find some explanation. Could it have been a person in a costume? No way. The movement was too natural, too fluid. The proportions were all wrong for a human. A bear standing on its hind legs? Definitely not. I've seen plenty of bears in my life. This wasn't that. The next morning, I drove back to the spot. I'm not sure what I expected to find. Footprints, maybe. But it had rained lightly overnight, and the roadside was a mess of mud and fallen leaves. If there had been tracks, they were gone now. I spent the next few days in a daze. I couldn't focus at work, couldn't sleep well at night. I finally broke down and told my wife about a week later. She was skeptical, of course, but she knows I'm not the type to make up stories or exaggerate. I've never been interested in paranormal stuff or conspiracy theories. I'm the guy who rolls his eyes at ghost stories and changes the channel when those Bigfoot hunting shows come on. After about 2 weeks of keeping it mostly to myself, I decided to talk to my uncle, who still works at the sheriff's department. I figured if anyone would listen without immediately thinking I was nuts, it would be him. We met for coffee at his place, away from any prying ears. I still remember the look on his face when I told him, not outright disbelief, just careful consideration. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time before he finally said, "You're not the first person to report something like this around here." That hit me like a ton of bricks. He told me there had been 3 other reports in the last decade from that same general area, all describing something similar. Large, upright, covered in hair, moving with an unusual gait. The department never officially investigated any of them because there was nothing to investigate. No crime committed, no evidence left behind. Just sightings. "We keep these things quiet," my uncle said. No sense causing a panic or turning the county into a circus for those Bigfoot TV shows. I agreed to keep it to myself, at least locally. But the experience has been eating at me for months now. I can't stop thinking about it. I can't stop wondering what the hell it was I saw on that road. I've since done a lot of reading on Sasquatch encounters. Some of the descriptions match what I saw so perfectly it gives me chills. Especially the details about those long swinging arms and that fluid stride. How could so many people across the country describe the exact same unusual features if they weren't seeing something real? I went back to that area several times in the weeks after my sighting, always during daylight hours and usually with my rifle. I never saw anything unusual again, but the woods there feel different to me now. I find myself scanning the tree line, looking for movement, listening more carefully to the sounds around me. One thing that keeps bothering me is the casual way it crossed the road. It wasn't startled by my truck. It didn't run or try to hide. It moved with purpose, like it knew exactly where it was going, like it belonged there more than I did. The weeks following my encounter, I had trouble sleeping. I'd wake up at the slightest sound outside our house. My wife kept asking what was wrong, and even though I'd told her what I saw, I don't think she understood how deeply it affected me. How do you explain that your entire worldview has been shattered? About a month after the sighting, I was in my workshop out back when I heard something moving around in the woods behind our property. It was already dark, around 8 in the evening. We live on the outskirts of town, with about 2 acres of land that backs up to a large wooded area. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, sweeping the beam across the tree line. I didn't see anything, but I heard branches breaking, not like a squirrel or raccoon moving through the underbrush, but heavy steps, like something substantial was moving through the woods. Then I caught a whiff of something, a strong, musky odor unlike anything I'd smelled before. It reminded me of wet dog combined with something else I can't quite describe, something wild. I didn't venture into the woods that night. Call me a coward, but something primitive in my brain told me to stay put, to not go looking for trouble. I went back inside, locked all the doors, and sat up half the night with my shotgun across my lap, listening. Nothing came closer to the house, and eventually the sounds faded away. But that wasn't the end of it. Over the next week, I found 3 of my trash cans tipped over on different mornings, garbage strewn across the yard. We've had problems with raccoons and the occasional black bear before, but this was different. The cans had been moved several yards from where they'd been placed, and one was actually dented on the side, like something had squeezed it too hard. I set up a trail camera near the edge of the woods, hoping to catch whatever was getting into our trash. After 4 nights, the camera was gone. Not damaged, not knocked over, completely gone. The strap I'd used to secure it to the tree had been snapped, not cut or chewed through, just broken with sheer force. That's when I started to wonder if whatever I'd seen on the road that evening had followed me home somehow. Had it picked up my scent? Was it curious about me because I'd seen it? These might sound like crazy questions, but after what I'd witnessed, nothing seemed too far-fetched anymore. The disturbances around our property continued for about 3 weeks, then stopped as suddenly as they'd started. Part of me was relieved, but another part was even more unsettled. Why had it stopped? Had it moved on to another area, or was it just being more careful now? It's been almost a year since my sighting, and I still haven't found a rational explanation for what I saw. I've gone back and forth between trying to convince myself it was something normal that my mind misinterpreted, and accepting that there are things in these woods that science hasn't properly documented yet. I've lived in this area my entire life. I know these woods, these back roads. I've hunted here since I was a kid. But that evening in October showed me that no matter how well you think you know a place, there are always secrets hiding in the shadows. Last week, I was at the hardware store when an older man I didn't recognize came in. He was talking to Joe, who owns the place, about some strange noises he'd been hearing around his property out near the county line. He described them as wood knocks and whooping calls late at night. Joe just nodded and changed the subject, but I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I wanted to talk to this man, to ask him more about what he'd heard, but something held me back. Maybe it was the fear of being labeled as that crazy Bigfoot guy in our small town. Or maybe it was something deeper, a sense that some knowledge is better left unpursued. I still drive that same road sometimes, usually in broad daylight now. I can't help but slow down at that exact spot, my eyes scanning the tree line, both hoping to see something and terrified that I might. The logical part of my brain says it was a one-time thing, a freak encounter. But another part of me knows better. Whatever it was I saw that evening, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, or something else entirely, it changed me. Not in any dramatic way that others would notice. I still go to work, still fish on weekends, still live my normal life. But inside, I know the world is stranger and wilder than most people realize. I don't expect anyone to believe my story. Hell, I'm not sure I would believe it if someone else told it to me. But I know what I saw, crossing that road in the fading October light. I know it was real. And sometimes late at night, when the wind moves through the trees behind our house and strange shadows play across the yard, I wonder if it's out there still, watching and waiting, just beyond the reach of our understanding.